He thought it was just a small act of kindness on a freezing night, but that ride put him right in the middle of a dangerous secret. She was running from something. Powerful people wanted her found and silenced. And when he learned who she really was, it was already too late to turn back. Now, every mile they drive brings them closer to the truth, and closer to the people willing to destroy anyone who stands in their way. They'll hurt the people you love if I stay. Can one man protect her long enough to expose the truth? Or will this kindness cost them everything? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The January wind rattled Frank Carter's old pickup truck as he navigated the icy roads, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel. After 14 hours at Pete's auto shop, his fingers still carried traces of engine grease despite repeated scrubbing. The heater wheezed weakly, barely keeping up with the bitter cold seeping through the truck's worn seals. Streetlights cast lonely pools of yellow on the slick asphalt. Frank's thoughts drifted to Lily, his 10-year-old daughter, probably curled up at Mrs. Henderson's house next door, working on her math homework. The image brought a tired smile to his face, even as he calculated the babysitting money he'd owe their elderly neighbor. That's when he saw her, a solitary figure huddled against the wind, one hand clutching a backpack, the other pulled inside a coat that seemed better suited for autumn than this brutal Midwest winter. Frank's chest tightened. The girl couldn't have been more than 16 or 17, and the temperature was dropping fast. He eased off the gas, years of experience helping him manage the truck on the slippery road. The responsible thing would be to call the police. He knew that. But something in her posture, the way she hunched forward, trying to make herself smaller, stirred memories of the scared kids he'd encountered during his National Guard days. Frank pulled over about 20 feet ahead of her, gravel crunching under his tires. He reached across and rolled down the passenger window, letting in a blast of frigid air. "Hey there," he called out, keeping his voice gentle, non-threatening. "It's getting pretty dangerous out here. Can I give you a ride somewhere?" The girl stopped, her body tensing. The wind whipped strands of dark hair across her face as she studied him with wary eyes. Up close, Frank could see her lips had taken on a bluish tinge, and her cheeks were raw from the cold. "I'm Frank," he offered, speaking slowly and clearly. "I've got my mechanic's ID right here if you want to see it." He pointed to the badge clipped to his worn work jacket, not making any sudden moves. "There's a shelter in town, or I could take you wherever you need to go." She shifted from foot to foot, clearly weighing her options. Another gust of wind cut through the night, and she wrapped her arms tighter around herself. "The shelter," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. If you're sure it's no trouble." "No trouble at all," Frank replied, reaching over to push open the passenger door. "Hop in before you freeze solid." The girl approached cautiously, like a wild animal, expecting a trap. She kept her backpack clutched to her chest as she climbed in, settling as close to the door as possible. Frank noticed how she immediately checked for the door handle, likely making sure she had an escape route. "I'm Sophie," she said after a moment, though she kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Frank nodded, pulling back onto the street with careful movements. "Nice to meet you, Sophie. Don't worry if the heater's not great. This old girl's got character, but she's not too fancy." Sophie didn't respond, but Frank saw her slowly extend her trembling hands toward the heat vent. Her coat was expensive. He could tell that much despite its worn condition, but far too light for January in the Midwest. Her shoes were similarly high-end but impractical, fashion boots with smooth soles that would be treacherous on ice. The silence stretched between them as Frank navigated through the quiet streets. He kept his movements predictable, narrating his turns out loud. Taking a right here at the hardware store. Another couple blocks to Main Street. He'd learned during his guard days that letting people know what to expect helped ease their fears. Under the passing streetlights, he caught glimpses of Sophie's face. Despite her expensive clothes, there was something haunted in her expression that tugged at his paternal instincts. She was somebody's daughter, out alone on a dangerous night. When they stopped at a red light, Frank noticed Sophie's violent shivering hadn't subsided, even in the truck's cabin. Her fingers, when she brushed back her hair, were still white with cold. "Listen," he said, keeping his tone casual. "The shelter's still about 15 minutes away, and you look like you could use something warm in your system. There's a diner just up ahead, Miss Ruby's, best hot chocolate in 3 counties. What do you say we stop and get you thawed out first?" Sophie's eyes darted to his face, searching for hidden meanings or threats. Frank kept his expression open, neutral. After a long moment, she gave a small nod. "Thank you," she whispered, and Frank caught a tremor in her voice that had nothing to do with a cold. That's really kind." "Hey, no problem. My daughter would never forgive me if I let someone freeze when a cup of hot chocolate could fix it." He turned the truck toward Miss Ruby's, its neon sign glowing like a beacon in the winter night. "Besides, I could use a coffee myself. Been a long day under the hoods." As they pulled into the diner's parking lot, Frank glanced over at Sophie again. Her lips were still blue, her hand shaking as she gripped her backpack. Whatever her story was, and he could tell there was quite a story, it could wait until she was warm. Right now, that was all that mattered. The bell above the door of Murphy's Diner jingled as Frank held it open for Sophie. Warm air and the smell of coffee wrapped around them, a welcome change from the biting wind outside. At this hour, only a few regulars occupied the worn red booths, truckers mainly, warming up before hitting the road again. Betty, the night shift waitress Frank had known for years, looked up from wiping down the counter. Her eyebrows rose slightly at the sight of the teenage girl, but her welcoming smile never wavered. "Take any seat you like, hon," Betty called out, already reaching for the coffee pot. Frank guided Sophie to a booth near the radiator, noticing how she chose the seat facing the door. The vinyl cushions squeaked as she slid in, her backpack clutched tight against her chest. "Two hot cocos, Betty," Frank said, settling into the opposite bench. "Extra whipped cream if you've got it." Under the harsh fluorescent lights, Frank got his first good look at Sophie. Her face was young but tired, dark circles underneath wary eyes. Her coat was expensive once, some fancy brand his daughter Lily would probably recognize. But now it was worn at the edges, missing a button near the collar. Her shoes told a similar story. Designer sneakers, scuffed and mud-splattered. Betty brought their cocos, topped with generous swirls of whipped cream. "Anything else for you two?" Frank glanced at Sophie. "Hungry? The grilled cheese here's pretty good." Sophie shook her head, hands wrapping around the warm mug. "This is fine, thank you." Betty gave Frank a knowing look before moving away to check on other customers. "I'm Frank, by the way, Frank Carter." He took a sip of his cocoa, keeping his movements slow and predictable. "You said your name's Sophie?" "Yes." Her voice was soft but clear, carrying a hint of an accent he couldn't place. "Private school? Maybe." The door chimed again, and Sophie's head snapped toward the sound. Just another trucker, stomping snow from his boots. Frank pretended not to notice her reaction, but his guard training kicked in, cataloging details, the way she positioned herself, how her eyes tracked exits, the slight tremor in her hands that wasn't just from cold. "There's a good women's shelter about 10 minutes from here," Frank said carefully. "Safe place. Run by Sister Margaret. She's strict but fair. They've got warm beds, hot showers, and people who can help if you need it." Sophie's fingers tightened around her mug. "I don't need help. Everybody needs help sometimes." Frank kept his tone light, matter of fact. "I sure do. Got a 10-year-old daughter at home. Some days I don't know how I'd manage without my neighbors pitching in." Something flickered across Sophie's face at the mention of Lily. Recognition, maybe, or longing, but it vanished quickly behind that careful mask. They finished their cocos in comfortable silence. When Frank paid the bill, Sophie watched him count out worn dollar bills with an expression he couldn't read. The shelter was a converted Victorian house, its windows glowing warmly against the night. Sister Margaret answered Frank's knock personally, a tall woman with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Welcome, welcome," she said, ushering them into a cozy front room that smelled of cinnamon and furniture polish. "You're just in time. We were about to lock up for the night." While Sister Margaret gathered intake forms, Sophie stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, taking in the worn but clean furniture, the inspirational posters on the walls, the basket of knitting supplies beside an ancient armchair. "Just some basic information," Sister Margaret explained, setting the papers on a coffee table. "Whatever you're comfortable sharing. Would you like Mr. Carter to wait outside?" Sophie shook her head quickly. She sat on the edge of the couch, pen hovering over the forms. As she leaned forward, something slipped from her coat, a flash of gold that hit the hardwood floor with a metallic ping. Frank bent to retrieve it, an ornate locket on a delicate chain, its surface etched with intricate scrollwork. It must have popped open in the fall because a small photograph was visible inside. He meant to just close it and hand it back, but the woman's face in the photo caught his eye. He knew that face. The sharp cheekbones, the confident smile, the perfectly styled dark hair. He'd seen it just last week, helping Lily with her school project on successful women in business. There she was, Vivian Ashford, CEO of Ashford International Hotels, smiling from the pages of Forbes magazine. And in her arms, a toddler with Sophie's eyes. The locket trembled in Frank's hand as the implications hit him. He looked up to find Sophie watching him, her face pale but composed, waiting for his reaction. "I can explain," she said quietly. The gold locket lay open in Frank's weathered palm, its surface catching the diner's fluorescent light. The photo inside showed a much younger Sophie, maybe 3 or 4 years old, sitting in the lap of an elegant woman with perfectly styled dark hair and a confident smile. Frank recognized that face. He'd seen it just last week, while flipping through an old Forbes magazine in the library's waiting area, while Lily did her homework. "Is this?" Frank kept his voice gentle, careful not to startle Sophie, who was staring into her now empty cocoa mug. "Is this your mother, Vivian Ashford?" Sophie's fingers tightened around the ceramic mug. Her shoulders tensed, but she gave a small nod. "She doesn't want me anymore," Sophie whispered, her voice cracking on the last word. She turned her face toward the window, but Frank caught the gleam of tears in her eyes. Outside, snow was starting to fall again, fat flakes drifting past the glass. Betty appeared with the check, took one look at Sophie's expression, and quietly retreated. Frank had never been more grateful for the waitress's intuition. "Hey," Frank said softly, sliding the locket across the table. "I don't know your whole story, and you don't have to tell me. But I've learned something in my years. People can surprise you with their kindness, sometimes when you least expect it." Sophie wiped quickly at her eyes with her sleeve. "You don't know my family." "You're right, I don't," Frank agreed. "But I know what it's like to feel alone, and you're not alone right now." The corner of Sophie's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something close. She picked up the locket, running her thumb over its intricate engravings before slipping it into her coat pocket. "The shelter's just a few blocks away," Frank said, leaving a generous tip for Betty. "Ms. Martinez runs it. She's good people, been helping folks get back on their feet for 20 years. The snow was falling harder as they pulled into the shelter's small parking lot. The building was an old Victorian house, its yellow paint faded but warm lights glowing in every window. Christmas lights still twinkled along the porch railings, giving it a welcoming feel despite the late hour. Ms. Martinez met them at the door, her silver hair in a neat bun and her dark eyes sharp but kind. She was wearing a hand-knit sweater with snowflakes on it, and her smile put Sophie visibly at ease. "Welcome, dear," she said, ushering them into a cozy sitting room with worn but clean furniture. "Let's get you settled in." While Ms. Martinez helped Sophie with the intake forms, Frank noticed how the teenager's posture gradually relaxed. The shelter felt safe. There were other women around, some reading in corners, others helping in the kitchen where something that smelled like soup was simmering. "We have a bed ready upstairs," Miss Martinez told Sophie, "and some spare toiletries, warm pajamas. We'll get you everything you need." "Thank you," Sophie murmured, her voice small but sincere. "And you'll look after her?" Frank asked Miss Martinez quietly while Sophie was distracted by the shelter's resident cat, an orange tabby that had wandered over to investigate. "Like she was my own," Miss Martinez assured him. "We've got good security here, Frank. She'll be safe." Frank nodded, relieved. He turned to Sophie, who was now petting the cat with tentative fingers. "I've got to head home. My daughter will be wondering where I am, but Miss Martinez and her team will take good care of you." Sophie stood, hugging her backpack to her chest again. "Thank you," she said, "for stopping, for the cocoa, she gestured vaguely at the shelter. "Everything." "Anyone would have done the same," Frank said. Sophie shook her head. "No, they wouldn't have." Ms. Martinez led them to the front door. The snow had let up a bit, leaving a fresh blanket of white on the ground. Frank stepped out onto the porch, then turned back for one last look. Sophie stood in the doorway, the warm light from inside creating a soft glow around her. She raised her hand in a small wave, and this time, a faint but genuine smile crossed her face. It transformed her whole expression, making her look, for just a moment, like the carefree little girl from the locket photo. Frank waved back, then trudged through the snow to his truck. As he started the engine, he could still see Sophie in the doorway. "Ms. Martinez's gentle hand on her shoulder, before the door finally closed between them. The old pickup's engine sputtered as Frank turned onto his street. The day's events weighed heavy on his mind. The shivering girl, that expensive locket, and the sadness in Sophie's eyes when she mentioned her mother. His headlights swept across unfamiliar vehicles. Two black SUVs parked across from his modest single-story house, their tinted windows reflecting the streetlight. Frank's hands tightened on the steering wheel. In their small town, everyone knew everyone else's cars. These weren't local. He pulled into his driveway, killing the engine but staying in the truck for a moment, watching through his rearview mirror. Two men emerged from the first SUV. Even in the dim evening light, their suits looked expensive, the kind you'd see in fancy department stores, not at the local men's warehouse. They moved with practiced precision, like dancers following familiar steps. The taller one adjusted his tie as they approached. Frank stepped out of his truck, making sure to grab his toolbox. The weight of it felt reassuring in his hand. "Mr. Carter?" The shorter man spoke first. His voice was smooth, too smooth, like a radio announcer's. "Sorry to bother you so late. I'm Mr. Henley, and this is Mr. Cray. We're looking for someone we believe you might have seen today." Frank set his toolbox down slowly. "That right?" "A young girl," Cray said, his words clipped and precise. 16 years old, brown hair, blue eyes, carrying a backpack. She's troubled, potentially dangerous. Dangerous! Frank kept his face neutral, thinking of Sophie's trembling hands around that cocoa mug. "How so?" "She's been known to make up stories," Henley said, sliding his hands into his pockets. "Wild accusations, lies that could hurt people. Her family is very concerned." A car passed by, its headlights washing over them. In that brief moment, Frank caught something in their eyes, something cold and calculating that had nothing to do with family concern. "Haven't seen anyone like that," Frank said, reaching down for his toolbox. "Town's pretty quiet most days." "You sure about that?" Cray took a step closer. "Because we heard someone matching her description was seen getting into a pickup truck, similar to yours." Frank shrugged, fishing for his house keys. "Lots of pickups in town, kind of vehicle you need around here." "Of course," Henley smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "If you do see her, we'd appreciate a call." He held out a business card between two manicured fingers. "Day or night, her family's very worried." Frank took the card, noting the lack of company name or title, just a phone number in plain black text. "I'll keep an eye out." "You do that," Cray said. "And Mr. Carter, if you're thinking of getting involved in something complicated, don't. Some situations are better left alone." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Frank met Cray's gaze steadily. "Just a mechanic here, gentlemen. Nothing complicated about fixing cars." They retreated to their SUVs with the same calculated precision they'd arrived with. Frank watched them pull away, their taillights disappearing around the corner. But they drove slowly, too slowly, like they were memorizing every detail of his house. Inside, the silence felt heavy. Frank's dinner, leftover meatloaf he'd made when Lily was home last weekend, sat in its plastic container on the kitchen table where he'd left it this morning. He hadn't even taken off his jacket yet. He sank into a kitchen chair, staring at the untouched food. His appetite had vanished. The business card sat on the table in front of him, that single phone number seeming to mock him with its simplicity. Those men hadn't been family representatives or concerned parties. They moved like hunters, spoke like people used to getting their way through fear, and they were looking for Sophie. The teenager who'd clutched that hot cocoa like it was the first warm thing she'd held in days. The girl who'd tried so hard to hide her tears when talking about her mother. The child who'd given him that small, grateful wave from the shelter doorway. Frank pushed the meatloaf aside, his mind racing. If those men found her at the shelter, he didn't want to complete that thought. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence, each second marking time that Sophie might still be safe or might not be. Frank sat there, the overhead light casting a shadow long across the linoleum floor, knowing that his simple life had just become anything but simple. The morning sun cast long shadows across the frost-covered playground as Frank's pickup rumbled to a stop in front of Lily's elementary school. His daughter gathered her backpack and lunchbox, the sparkly unicorn on the front catching the light. "Have a good day, sweetheart," Frank said, reaching over to give her a quick hug. "Remember, Mrs. Johnson is picking you up for your playdate after school." "I know, Dad." Lily rolled her eyes but smiled, hopping out of the truck. She turned back, her small face serious. "Did the girl from yesterday find a safe place to stay?" Frank's heart squeezed. Even at 10, Lily had such a caring soul. "I took her to the shelter, honey. She'll be okay." But as he watched Lily skip up the school steps, he wasn't so sure. Those men in the SUVs hadn't looked like concerned family members. Their practiced smiles hadn't reached their eyes. Once Lily disappeared inside, Frank pulled out his phone and dialed the shelter's number. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel as it rang. "Good morning, Hope Haven Women's Shelter," a familiar voice answered. "Hi, Mrs. Baker. This is Frank Carter. I brought Sophie in last night." There was a pause. "Oh, Mr. Carter, I'm afraid Sophie. She left early this morning, before dawn." Frank sat up straighter. "Left? What happened?" "Two men came by late last night, asking about her. They had badges, said they were private investigators." Mrs. Baker's voice wavered. "We told them we couldn't confirm or deny if anyone was here. That's our policy. But when I went to check on Sophie at breakfast time, her bed was empty. Just a note saying, 'Thank you.'" Frank's stomach dropped. "These men? Were they wearing expensive suits? Driving black SUVs?" "Yes, actually. Do you know them?" "They showed up at my house, too." Frank started the engine. "Thanks, Mrs. Baker. I need to go." He drove through town slowly, scanning sidewalks and alleys. The bus station, he thought. If he were running, that's where he'd go. The old brick building came into view, its faded sign barely readable, a handful of people huddled on the benches outside, collars turned up against the cold. And there, a familiar figure in a thin coat, sitting alone with a backpack clutched to her chest. Sophie. Frank parked and approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. But she noticed him anyway, jumping to her feet with wide eyes. "It's okay," he said, holding up his hands. "I'm not here to make you do anything you don't want to do." Sophie glanced toward the station entrance. "How did you find me?" "I was worried. Those men, they came to my house last night, asking about you." Frank kept his voice gentle. "Then I heard they showed up at the shelter too." Sophie's face paled. Did they threaten you?" "Not exactly. But they didn't seem like people who take no for an answer." Frank gestured to the empty bench beside her. "Mind if I sit?" She hesitated, then nodded. Frank settled beside her, leaving plenty of space between them. "I don't know what you're running from," he said carefully. "And you don't have to tell me. But those men, they're not giving up. And you look like you could use a friend right now." Sophie's fingers twisted in the straps of her backpack. I can't get anyone else involved. It's not safe." "I was in the National Guard for 12 years, Frank said. "Served 2 tours overseas. I know how to handle trouble." He paused, watching her face. "And I know what it looks like when someone needs help but is too scared to ask for it." A bus pulled up to the curb, its brakes squealing. Sophie watched as passengers filed off, then turned to Frank with tears in her eyes. "They'll hurt anyone who helps me," she whispered. "They made that very clear." "Let me worry about that." Frank stood, offering his hand. "If those men are after you, we need to get you somewhere safe. My truck's right over there. What do you say?" Sophie looked at his outstretched hand, then at the bus station entrance. Another set of passengers was boarding, heading who knew where. She could disappear, become another faceless traveler. Or she took Frank's hand, letting him help her up. "Okay." They walked to the truck quickly, Sophie keeping her head down. Frank opened the passenger door for her, then hurried around to the driver's side. As he started the engine, fat snowflakes began drifting down from the gray sky. "My house isn't far," he said, pulling away from the curb. "We'll figure this out together." Sophie huddled in her seat, watching the snow fall harder outside the window. She didn't respond, but some of the tension had left her shoulders. For now, at least, she wasn't alone anymore. The old pickup moved carefully through the increasingly snowy streets, carrying them toward whatever would come next. The afternoon sun filtered through the kitchen curtains as Frank stood at the counter, buttering bread for grilled cheese sandwiches. The familiar sound of Lily's footsteps bounding up the porch stairs made him smile. The door swung open, and his daughter's cheerful voice filled the small house. "Dad, I got an A on my math test." Lily's triumphant announcement stopped short when she noticed Sophie sitting quietly on their worn living room couch. Her backpack dropped to the floor with a soft thud. Sophie gave a small wave, her shoulders tense. "Hi." Frank watched as his daughter's surprise transformed into a warm smile. "You're the girl from Dad's truck." "I'm Lily." She plopped down next to Sophie without hesitation, pulling out her homework folder. "Do you like math? I have fractions to do tonight." Sophie's rigid posture softened slightly. "Actually, I'm pretty good at fractions." She scooted closer to look at Lily's worksheet. "Want some help?" Frank turned back to the stove, hiding his relief at how naturally the girls were connecting. The butter sizzled as he laid the first sandwich in the pan. Behind him, Sophie's quiet voice explained reducing fractions while Lily asked questions with her usual enthusiasm. See, if you divide both the top and bottom numbers by the same thing, it's like splitting a pizza into smaller pieces, Sophie explained. The pizza's still the same size, just cut differently. Oh, that makes way more sense than what Mrs. Cooper said, Lily exclaimed. Dad, Sophie explains math better than my teacher, Frank chuckled, flipping a perfectly golden brown sandwich onto a plate. That's great, sweetheart. How about you two wash up? Dinner's almost ready. The girls cleared Lily's homework from the coffee table as Frank set out plates and napkins. It felt strangely normal, like Sophie had always been part of their evening routine. But when they sat down to eat, Frank noticed how she took small, careful bites, as if afraid to seem too hungry. These are really good, Sophie said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. We never had grilled cheese at home. The cook always made fancy things I couldn't pronounce. Lily's eyes widened. You had a cook? Like in the movies? Sophie nodded, picking at the crust of her sandwich. And maids, and drivers, and security guards. Her voice grew quieter. But nobody really talked to me, except to tell me what to do or what not to do. Frank watched as she set down her sandwich, her hands trembling slightly. After my mom married Richard, my stepfather, things got even worse. He had all these rules about proper behavior and family image. That sounds lonely, Lily said, reaching over to pat Sophie's hand. The simple gesture seemed to give Sophie courage. 2 weeks ago, I was looking for my phone charger in Richard's office. He was having a meeting in the hotel conference room next door. Sophie wrapped her arms around herself. The wall between the office and conference room is thin. I heard him talking about using our hotels for moving things. Bad things, money and other stuff that wasn't legal. Frank set down his own sandwich, listening intently as Sophie continued. When I asked him about it later, he got really angry. Said I was being nosy and disrespectful. Sophie's voice cracked. The next morning, 2 men came to take me to a boarding school in Switzerland. They wouldn't even let me say goodbye to my mom. Lily gasped. That's awful. Did you run away from the school? Sophie nodded. The first night there, I heard the headmaster on the phone with Richard. They were talking about behavior modification and breaking stubborn spirits. I knew I had to leave. She looked down at her half-eaten sandwich. I took money from my trust fund account and bought a bus ticket back to the States. I've been moving from town to town, trying to stay ahead of Richard's security team. Frank sat in silence, processing Sophie's story. The men in the SUVs made more sense now. They weren't concerned family members. They were hired muscle. His protective instinct, already strong, grew stronger with each detail Sophie shared. Your mom, he said carefully. Does she know what's happening? Sophie shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. She's always traveling for work. Richard handles everything else, that's what she says. And he's really good at making things sound reasonable when he explains them to her. Lily got up and wrapped her arms around Sophie in a tight hug. You can stay with us. Right, Dad? We'll keep you safe. Frank met Sophie's uncertain gaze across the table. In her eyes, he saw fear mixed with a desperate hope that finally, someone would believe her. Someone would help. The weight of that trust settled on his shoulders, heavy but necessary. The kitchen clock ticked steadily as Frank considered their situation. He'd always taught Lily to stand up for what was right, even when it was hard. Now it was his turn to live those values, despite the risks. Sophie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I shouldn't have told you all this. I'm just putting you in danger too. No, Frank said firmly. You did the right thing. Sometimes being brave means asking for help. He watched as relief washed over Sophie's face, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since she'd started talking. Lily was still hugging her, chattering about sharing her room and having the best sleepover ever. The remnants of their dinner sat forgotten on the table as the gravity of Sophie's situation settled over them. Frank knew their quiet life had just become much more complicated, but looking at the two girls, his bright, caring daughter and this brave young woman who'd risked everything to do what was right, he felt certain they were doing the right thing. Sophie looked down at her plate, pushing the last bits of her sandwich around. Thank you, she whispered, for listening, for believing me. Frank nodded, the weight of responsibility for her safety growing with each passing moment. He had decisions to make, plans to consider, but for now, he'd focus on making sure Sophie felt secure in their home. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The kitchen clock ticked past 9, and silence settled over Frank's small house. Lily's soft breathing drifted from her bedroom, where she'd fallen asleep clutching her favorite stuffed penguin. Sophie sat curled up on the living room couch, her borrowed blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, staring at nothing in particular. Frank moved quietly through the house, checking the locks for the third time. The events of the day felt surreal. A runaway heiress at his kitchen table, dark suits prowling the streets, whispered confessions of corruption. His mind kept circling back to the threatening undertone in those men's voices outside the shelter. A sharp knock cut through the quiet. Sophie's head snapped up, her face draining of color. Frank held up a steadying hand and crept to the window. Through a gap in the blinds, he saw them. The same two men from earlier, their black SUV idling at the curb. The porch light caught the gleam of their expensive watches and polished shoes. Another knock, harder this time. "Don't answer it," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. She'd pulled her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible. Frank stayed perfectly still, watching. The taller man raised his hand to knock again but paused. They exchanged looks, then the shorter one pulled something from his coat pocket. Frank heard the soft scrape of paper being pushed under his door. Through the window, he watched them return to their vehicle. The SUV's engine growled as it pulled away, its taillights disappearing around the corner. Only then did Frank move to retrieve what they'd left. It was a plain white business card. No names, no company logo, just a phone number printed in stark black ink and 5 words. "Call us before it's too late." Sophie appeared at his elbow, trembling as she read the card. "They won't stop," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. "My stepfather, he has people everywhere. Private security, former military." Her voice cracked. "I can't go back there. Please don't make me go back." Frank studied the card, then slowly tore it into tiny pieces. "Nobody's making you go anywhere you don't want to," he said firmly. The protective instinct that had first made him stop for her on that snowy road surged stronger than ever. He went to the kitchen and pulled out an old road atlas from under the junk drawer. The pages were coffee-stained and dog-eared, but the maps were still good. "I've got a friend," he said, spreading the atlas on the counter. "Lives about 3 hours north, runs a small farm. We stayed there once when Lily was little, and our furnace died in the middle of winter." Sophie stepped closer, hope flickering across her face. "You'd really help me leave?" "Those men aren't going to stop coming around," Frank said, tracing a route with his finger. "And I don't trust their intentions. We need to get you somewhere safe while we figure this out." He glanced toward Lily's room. "My daughter's safety comes first, which means I can't have dangerous people showing up at our door." "I'm so sorry," Sophie whispered. "I never meant to put you in danger. I can try to leave on my own." "Not happening," Frank cut her off gently. "You're just a kid, and you need help. Sometimes doing the right thing means taking a risk." He smiled slightly. "Besides, Lily would never forgive me if I let anything happen to her new math tutor." Sophie managed a weak smile at that. Earlier, she'd helped Lily understand fractions using cookie pieces as examples. The memory of their laughter seemed to belong to a different world now. Frank pulled out his ancient flip phone. "I'm going to call my friend. Then we need to pack just essentials. We'll leave before sunrise, while it's still dark." He paused. "You should try to get some sleep. There's a spare blanket in the hall closet, and you can use the couch." But Sophie shook her head. "I don't think I can sleep." Frank understood. He'd seen that same haunted look in soldiers' eyes during his National Guard days, the tension of waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Then help me make a list of what we need to pack," he said, pulling out a notepad. Sometimes having a task helps. They worked quietly, Frank jotting down necessities while keeping one eye on the window. Warm clothes, first aid kit, some non-perishable food, his emergency cash from the coffee can above the fridge, Lily's schoolbooks, they might be gone a while. The business card's warning echoed in his mind. Before it's too late. Too late for what? The threat felt like a physical weight in the room. Around 11, Frank caught Sophie stifling a yawn. "Try to rest," he insisted. "Even if you can't sleep, just lie down for a while. I'll keep watch." She nodded reluctantly and curled up on the couch. Frank draped the spare blanket over her, noting how young and vulnerable she looked in the dim light. Hard to believe this girl held secrets that could shake a corporate empire. While Sophie rested, Frank moved silently through the house, gathering supplies into his old military duffel bag. He wrote a note to his boss at the garage, claiming a family emergency. Another note from Mrs. Henderson next door, asking her to feed the cat. Every few minutes, he checked the street through the windows. No more black SUVs, but the night felt charged with tension, like the air before a storm. Finally, he settled into his armchair, keeping vigil as the hours crept by. The business card's pieces lay in the kitchen trash, but its message burned in his mind. They were out of time. At dawn, they would have to run. The old alarm clock barely had time to buzz before Frank's hand silenced it. 4:30 in the morning, and the world outside was still pitch black. He'd barely slept, spending most of the night planning their route and checking every sound. Moving quietly through the dark house, Frank gathered the emergency bags he'd packed earlier, clothes, basic supplies, and the cash he'd been saving for house repairs. He gently pushed open Lily's door, where a small nightlight cast star-shaped patterns on the ceiling. "Hey, sweetheart," he whispered, sitting on the edge of her bed. "Time to wake up." Lily stirred, rubbing her eyes. "Daddy? It's still dark." "We're going on a special road trip," Frank said, keeping his voice light and steady. "Like an adventure. Remember how you always wanted to see the sunrise from the road?" That got her attention. Lily sat up, her tangled hair framing her sleepy face. "Really? Now?" "Right now, but we need to be super quiet, okay? Like ninjas." In the living room, Sophie was already awake, or maybe she hadn't slept at all. She sat perched on the edge of the couch, her backpack clutched close. Her face was pale in the dim light, but her eyes were alert and watchful. "Ready?" Frank asked softly. Sophie nodded, pulling on her coat. She helped Lily tie her shoes while Frank did one last check of the house. The card with the phone number still lay on the kitchen counter where he'd left it. He pocketed it. Might be useful later. They slipped out through the back door, their footsteps crunching in the fresh snow. Frank's old pickup sat waiting, frost coating its windows. He helped Lily into the middle seat while Sophie climbed in on the passenger side. The engine coughed once, then rumbled to life. As they pulled away from the house, Frank watched the rearview mirror carefully. No headlights followed them down the empty streets. Lily dozed off again, her head resting against Sophie's shoulder. Sophie stayed awake, rigid and alert, watching the familiar buildings of town slide past into darkness. The sky was just beginning to lighten when they crossed the county line. Frank relaxed his grip on the steering wheel slightly. They drove in silence as the world slowly brightened around them. Snow-covered fields stretching out on either side of the highway. 2 towns over, when the sun was properly up, Frank pulled into the parking lot of a cheerful-looking diner called Mary's Morning Glory. The smell of coffee and bacon drifted out when they opened the door, and a bell jingled overhead. "Welcome in," called a waitress, leading them to a booth by the window. Lily, now fully awake and excited about their adventure, slid in next to Sophie. "Can I have chocolate chip pancakes?" Lily asked, already studying the kids' menu intently. "Sure can, sweetheart." Frank smiled, but his eyes were scanning the other customers, just a few early morning regulars, no suits in sight. While they waited for their food, Frank excused himself to make a phone call. In the diner's small entrance vestibule, he pulled out his cell phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years, hoping it was still good. 3 rings, then a familiar voice. Reyes speaking. "Tom, it's Frank Carter." A pause, then warmth filled the voice. "Frank? Man, it's been, 3 years? How are you?" "I need your help, Tom. It's complicated, and it's serious." The warmth was replaced by professional focus. Tom had always been good at reading tone. "Tell me." Frank kept his voice low, glancing occasionally through the window at their booth. "I've got Vivienne Ashford's daughter in my truck. She ran away from home after overhearing something about illegal dealings in her family's hotels. Now there are men looking for her, and they're not the friendly type." A low whistle from the other end. "The Ashford hotel chain? That's big business, Frank." "I know. But this girl's scared, Tom. Really scared. And whatever she heard, these people are willing to chase her across state lines to keep it quiet. Give me the details you have. I'll start digging." Frank told him everything Sophie had shared, watching as their breakfast arrived at the booth. Lily was showing Sophie how to make a smiley face on her pancakes with whipped cream. "I'll need to verify her identity," Tom said when Frank finished. "And we'll need proof of whatever she heard. But if this is real," he let out a breath, "this could be huge." "Just be careful, Tom. These people don't mess around. You know me. Careful's my middle name. Keep your phone on, but maybe get a burner too. I'll call when I have something." Back at the booth, Frank slid in across from the girls. Sophie had barely touched her food, but she was smiling at something Lily was saying about her pancake art. Everything okay? Sophie asked quietly when Lily was distracted by the small jukebox on their table. Yeah, that was an old friend. He's gonna help us figure this out. Sophie nodded, pushing her eggs around with her fork. I didn't mean to drag you into all this. You and Lily. You should be safe at home. Hey! Frank leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. You didn't drag us anywhere. I chose to help because it was the right thing to do. Sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy, but that doesn't make it any less right. Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes, but she blinked them back quickly. Lily, oblivious to the heavy moment, was happily explaining to her paper placemat why purple was definitely the best color for coloring unicorns. After breakfast, they got back on the highway. The morning sun made the snow-covered landscape glitter like diamond dust. Lily had dozed off again, this time leaning against Frank's arm. Sophie stared out the passenger window, watching the white fields roll past. Her voice was so soft, Frank almost missed it when she whispered, "Thank you for not leaving me." The gravel crunched under the truck's tires as Frank turned onto Martha Bennett's long driveway. The two-story farmhouse came into view, its white paint weathered but well-maintained, smoke curling from the brick chimney against the gray morning sky. A few chickens pecked their way across the yard, unbothered by the approaching vehicle. Martha stood on the wraparound porch, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a thick cardigan against the morning chill. Her warm smile creased the corners of her eyes as she watched them park. "Frank Carter," she called out. "It's been too long." She made her way down the porch steps with the careful movements of someone who knew their limitations but refused to be slowed by them. Frank helped Lily hop down from the truck. "Martha, thank you for this. I know it's a lot to ask." "Nonsense!" Martha cut him off, waving away his concerns. "Any friend of yours is welcome here." Her kind eyes settled on Sophie, who hung back slightly behind Frank. "And you must be Sophie. Come on in, all of you. I've got coffee brewing and hot chocolate for the girls." Inside, the farmhouse was warm and inviting, with well-worn furniture and quilts draped over the backs of chairs. The kitchen smelled of fresh-baked bread and coffee. Martha moved efficiently around the space, pulling mugs from cupboards while she talked. "The spare room upstairs is all made up," she said. "It's snug, but it'll fit you three just fine. Bathroom's right across the hall." Sophie stood near the kitchen doorway, her shoulders tense, until Lily grabbed her hand. "Can we see the chickens?" Lily asked, bouncing on her toes. "Please?" Martha smiled, reaching for a small bucket near the back door. "Of course you can. They need feeding anyway. The feed's right here in this bucket. Just scatter it in front of the coop, and they'll come running." Lily tugged Sophie toward the door, and after a glance at Frank for permission, Sophie followed. Through the kitchen window, Frank watched as Lily demonstrated the proper chicken feeding technique, while Sophie's tentative movements gradually became more confident. "She's been through something rough, hasn't she?" Martha asked quietly, setting a mug of coffee in front of Frank. Frank nodded, pulling out his phone. "Need to update Tom on where we are. He's looking into some things for us." "Go ahead," Martha said. "I'll keep an eye on the girls." Frank stepped onto the back porch, dialing Tom's number. While he talked in low tones about what Tom had discovered so far, he watched Martha join the girls by the chicken coop. The older woman was showing Sophie how to check for eggs, her movements slow and deliberate, her voice carrying just enough to be heard but not enough to startle. Sophie's face brightened when she pulled out her first egg, holding it carefully in both hands. Martha praised her technique, and even from the porch, Frank could see some of the tension leave Sophie's shoulders. After finishing his call with Tom, Frank joined them in the yard. Martha had moved on to showing the girls her small herb garden, explaining which plants were which and what they were used for in cooking. "The basil's not doing much now," she was saying. "But come spring, it'll take over this whole corner if you let it. Makes wonderful pesto." "I've never made pesto," Sophie said softly, running her fingers gently over a mint plant. "Well then," Martha replied, "we'll have to fix that when the basil comes back. For now, though, how about we all make some bread together? Nothing better than kneading dough when you've got things on your mind." In the kitchen, Martha set them all to work. Lily measured ingredients while Sophie mixed them in a large bowl. Even Frank was put to use, clearing space on the counter for kneading. Martha's gentle instructions filled the kitchen, along with the occasional puff of flour and Lily's giggles when she got some on her nose. As the afternoon wore on, the smell of baking bread filled the house. Martha showed Sophie how to make a simple stew to go with it, letting her chop vegetables while sharing stories about her own daughter, now grown with children of her own in California. When evening came, They gathered in the living room, bowls of steaming stew in their laps, thick slices of fresh bread on the coffee table. The fireplace crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Martha's old cat, Oscar, had claimed a spot on the rug near the hearth. "This is really good," Sophie said, looking surprised at her own creation. "Course it is," Martha replied. "You made it with care. That's the secret ingredient to any good meal." Lily, who had been unusually quiet while eating, suddenly asked, "Did you really used to be a teacher, Martha?" "I did indeed. Taught third grade for 37 years. That's why you're so good at explaining things," Lily declared with the certainty of a 10-year-old. Martha chuckled. "Well, thank you, dear. Though I think anyone can be good at explaining things if they care enough about helping others understand." The conversation flowed easily after that, with Martha sharing funny stories from her teaching days that had both girls laughing. Even Frank found himself relaxing into his chair, the worry of the past few days easing slightly in the warm, comfortable atmosphere. When Lily accidentally knocked over her empty bowl while acting out one of Martha's stories, the resulting clatter startled Oscar, who shot straight up in the air before darting under the sofa. Sophie's unexpected laugh rang out, clear and bright, surprising even herself. Soon they were all laughing, at the cat, at themselves, at the simple joy of being together in this cozy room while the world grew dark outside. Martha caught Frank's eye and gave him a small nod. In that moment, he knew they'd made the right choice coming here. Sometimes, safety wasn't just about locks and distance. Sometimes it was about finding people who could help heal what was broken inside. The fire popped and sparked, sending up a shower of embers that drew everyone's attention. Oscar cautiously emerged from under the sofa, deciding it was safe to reclaim his spot by the hearth. Sophie reached down to stroke his fur, and the old cat arched into her touch, purring loudly enough to be heard over the crackling flames. Morning sunlight streamed through Martha's kitchen windows, warming the cozy space that smelled of vanilla and melting butter. Sophie stood at the counter with Lily, both girls wearing borrowed aprons dusted with flour. Lily's face lit up as she showed Sophie how to roll cookie dough into perfect little balls. "Mom used to say 3 finger widths apart," Lily explained, demonstrating the spacing on the baking sheet. "That way they don't stick together when they get bigger." Sophie nodded, carefully following Lily's instructions. Her shoulders had gradually relaxed over the past hour, the rhythmic motions of baking creating a peaceful bubble around them. "These are going to be amazing," she said, managing a genuine smile. Outside on the wraparound porch, Frank leaned against the railing beside Martha. His coffee mug warmed his hands against the morning chill while chickens scratched in the yard below. "Poor child," Martha said softly after Frank finished explaining Sophie's situation. "Running from her own family. It's not right." Frank nodded, his expression troubled. "I keep thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't stopped that night. She was just walking down that road in the cold, Martha, like a ghost." Martha patted his arm. "The Lord puts people in our path for a reason, Frank Carter. You did the right thing." "I hope so." Frank stared into his coffee. "But now I've dragged Lily into this mess too. Those men who came to the house." He trailed off, the memory of their threatening presence still fresh. "Lily's safer with her daddy than anywhere else," Martha said firmly, "and that girl in there needs you both." Inside the kitchen, Sophie and Lily were sliding the first batch of cookies into the oven when Frank's phone rang. He stepped into the living room to answer it, but Sophie could still hear his side of the conversation through the open door. "Hey, Tom. Yeah, we're safe. What did you find?" Sophie's hand stilled on the cookie sheet as she strained to listen. Lily chatted away about the next batch, unaware of Sophie's sudden tension. "Shell companies?" Frank's voice grew quieter, but Sophie could still make out fragments. "Connected to organized crime, hotel properties, money laundering?" The blood drained from Sophie's face. She had suspected things were bad, but hearing it confirmed made her stomach twist. Lily noticed her expression. "Are you okay?" the younger girl asked. "You look kind of sick." Sophie forced a smile. "Just worried about burning the cookies," she said, but her hand shook slightly as she reached for more dough. When Frank returned to the kitchen, Sophie was quiet, mechanically forming cookie balls, while Lily chattered about wanting to feed the chickens later. Martha had gone to tend her garden, leaving the 3 of them alone with the sweet smell of baking. "These look wonderful," Frank said, trying to keep his tone light despite the worry lines around his eyes. "You two make quite a team." Lily beamed, but Sophie set down her spoon and wiped her hands on her apron. "Mr. Carter?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Frank nodded, following her to the living room while Lily stayed to watch the cookies through the oven window. Sophie's fingers twisted together nervously as she glanced toward the kitchen to make sure Lily couldn't hear. "I heard some of your phone call," she admitted, "about the shell companies and everything else." Frank's expression softened with concern. "I'm sorry you had to hear that, Sophie. Tom's just trying to help us understand what we're dealing with." Sophie took a deep breath, then reached for her backpack in the corner. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it and reached deep inside, past her few clothes and belongings. From a hidden pocket in the lining, she pulled out a small black USB drive. "I didn't just overhear things at home," she said quietly. I found documents on my stepfather's computer. Financial records, emails, everything." She held out the drive. "It's all encrypted. I was good with computers at school, so I made copies before I left. I thought maybe someday someone would believe me." Frank stared at the tiny device that could contain so much danger and so much hope. "That's why those men are so desperate to find you." Sophie nodded, her voice catching. "I didn't know who to trust, but you've done so much for me and Lily, and—" She swallowed hard. "You're the first person who's made me feel safe in a long time." Frank carefully took the drive, feeling the weight of Sophie's trust more heavily than the small piece of plastic in his palm. Through the kitchen doorway, they could hear Lily humming as she arranged fresh cookies on a cooling rack. "We'll figure this out together," Frank promised, pocketing the drive. "You're not alone anymore." Sophie's eyes welled with tears, but she managed a wobbly smile. The timer dinged in the kitchen, and Lily called out excitedly about the next batch being ready. "Better not let those burn," Frank said gently. "Sounds like you've got some important baking to finish." Sophie wiped her eyes and nodded, heading back to the kitchen where Lily waited. Frank watched them working together, the weight of the USB drive in his pocket, reminding him just how much was at stake. But seeing Sophie's shoulders relax as she helped Lily slide the hot cookies onto the cooling rack, he knew they'd made the right choice in protecting her, whatever the cost might be. Sophie's hands trembled slightly as she pulled the small USB drive from a hidden pocket she'd sewn into her backpack's lining. The morning light caught its metallic surface as she held it out to Frank, who sat at Martha's kitchen table. "I've been carrying this everywhere," Sophie said quietly. "It has copies of emails, financial records, everything I found on my stepfather's computer before." She swallowed hard. "Before they sent me away." Frank carefully took the drive, treating it like the precious evidence it was. "You were brave to grab this," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "And even braver to keep it safe all this time." Martha busied herself at the sink, pretending not to listen while keeping watch through the window. Lily sat cross-legged on a kitchen chair, munching on one of the fresh cookies they baked, her eyes wide with interest. "Tom gave me instructions on how to send this securely," Frank explained, pulling out his phone. He read through the text message again. "There's a courier service in town that handles sensitive documents. They'll get it to him by tomorrow morning." Sophie wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture Frank had noticed she made when seeking comfort. What if they intercept it? "Tom's smart about these things," Frank assured her. "The package will look like ordinary business mail, and it's going through a special service he trusts. Plus, he's already made copies of everything we've told him so far." Lily perked up, brushing cookie crumbs from her shirt. "Is Tom the one who was in the army with you, Dad? The one who wrote that big story about the corrupt mayor?" Frank nodded, managing a small smile. "That's him. He's good at getting the truth out there, no matter who tries to stop him." Martha emerged from the pantry with an old shoebox. "Here's something that might help package it securely," she offered. "We can wrap it up like a birthday present." They worked together, carefully cushioning the USB drive in tissue paper and securing it in the box. Martha had rainbow-colored wrapping paper left over from Christmas, and Lily insisted on adding a bright blue bow to make it look extra normal. Sophie watched the process intently, her fingers twisting in her lap. When the package was ready, Frank stood up, car keys in hand. "I'll drive into town now to send it. Should take about an hour, round trip." "Can I come?" Lily asked, bouncing on her toes. "I want to see how the courier place works." Frank shook his head. "Better if I go alone, sweetie. Less attention that way." "Then we should do something fun while we wait," Lily declared, turning to Sophie. "I know. We can make a scrapbook about our adventure, like a time capsule." Sophie's tense expression softened. "A scrapbook?" "Yeah, Martha. Do you have any craft stuff? We could put in pictures and tickets and maybe press some flowers from your garden and write about everything that's happened." Martha's eyes crinkled with warmth. "I think I have just the thing." She disappeared upstairs and returned with a stack of colored paper, some markers, and an empty photo album with cream-colored pages. "It's been sitting in my craft drawer for ages," Martha explained. "Better it gets used for making memories than collecting dust." For the first time that morning, Sophie's smile reached her eyes. "I used to love making scrapbooks when I was younger," she admitted, "before everything got so complicated." "Perfect," Lily declared, already sorting through the supplies. "We can start with yesterday, when we fed the chickens. I still have one of their feathers." Frank watched the girls settle at the kitchen table, their heads bent together over the blank pages as Martha showed them how to arrange things just so. The sight made his heart both lighter and heavier. Lighter seeing Sophie act like a normal teenager for once, heavier knowing how much she'd been through. "I'll be back soon," he promised, picking up the disguised package. "Stay inside, keep the doors locked." Martha nodded, her expression serious despite her gentle smile. "We'll be fine. The girls and I have plenty to keep us busy." As Frank drove the familiar dirt road toward town, he felt a surge of hope. The USB drive felt like a key, not just to exposing Sophie's stepfather's crimes, but to giving her back some control over her life. Tom would know exactly what to do with the information. The courier service was a small operation in a strip mall, sandwiched between a tax preparation office and a dry cleaner. Frank followed Tom's instructions precisely, paying in cash and using the cover story they'd prepared about sending business documents to an accounting firm. The drive back to Martha's felt lighter, as if a weight had shifted. They had taken action. They had a plan. Most importantly, Sophie had trusted them enough to share her evidence. As he turned onto the long driveway leading to the farmhouse, he could see Sophie and Lily through the kitchen window. They were laughing about something, decorating a page in their new scrapbook while Martha served them milk and more cookies. The scene looked so normal, so right, that Frank allowed himself to imagine a future where Sophie could always feel this safe and happy. Movement caught his eye as he parked. A dark sedan rolled past the property entrance, moving slower than the usual country traffic. Frank watched it in his rear-view mirror, his hands still on the steering wheel. The car continued down the road, unhurried, almost casual, but something about it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Martha's weathered hands clutched her apron as she pulled Frank aside in the mudroom. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the frosted windows, and her usually cheerful face was pinched with worry. "Two men stopped by earlier while you were in town," she said in a low voice, glancing toward the kitchen where Sophie and Lily were working on their scrapbook. "Said they were looking for directions to the highway, but something felt off about them." Frank's shoulders tensed. What did they look like? Dark suits, fancy car, stuck out like sore thumbs around here. One had a scar near his eye. Martha wrung her hands. "They kept looking at the house while we talked. Asked if I lived here alone." Frank ran a hand over his face, feeling the stubble of several days' worry. The familiar weight of responsibility settled deeper into his chest. "Did they say anything else?" "Asked if I'd seen any travelers passing through. Said they were looking for their boss's daughter." Martha's voice dropped even lower. "I played dumb. Told them I hadn't seen anyone but the mailman in days." Through the doorway, Frank could see Sophie helping Lily paste photos into their makeshift scrapbook. They'd used Martha's old magazines and craft supplies to create colorful borders around pictures they'd taken with Frank's phone. Sophie was smiling, showing Lily how to make paper flowers for decoration. The sight made his heart ache. This brief peace they'd found was about to be disrupted again. "We need to move," Frank said quietly. "Tonight, after Lily's asleep. I won't put you at risk by staying longer." Martha gripped his arm. "You don't have to go. My property's big. We could hide the truck in the old barn, and—" Frank shook his head. "Those men showing up means they're closing in. They might come back with more people or watch the house. We need to keep moving." In the kitchen, Lily's delighted laugh rang out as Sophie showed her how to fold an origami bird. The sound twisted something in Frank's chest. His daughter had grown so attached to Sophie in just these few days. "At least stay for dinner," Martha insisted. "I'll make my chicken and dumplings. Give the girls one more good meal before you go." Frank nodded, knowing they could use the energy for the road ahead. "Thank you, Martha, for everything." The afternoon passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Martha bustled around the kitchen, showing Sophie how to roll out dumpling dough while Lily set the table with the good plates, the ones with tiny painted flowers around the edges. Frank kept watch through the windows, noting every passing car. During dinner, he caught Sophie's eye and gave a slight nod. Her face fell for just a moment before she covered it with a smile, helping Lily tell a story about the chickens they'd fed that morning. She understood what was coming. Martha outdid herself with dinner, serving seconds and then slipping extra cookies into napkins for later. When Lily started yawning over her dessert, Frank carried her up to the guest room they'd been using. She fell asleep quickly, still wearing her favorite purple sweater. Once Lily's breathing had deepened into sleep, Frank eased out of the room. He found Sophie already in the hallway, her backpack packed and ready. They moved silently through the house, gathering their few belongings. In the kitchen, Martha pressed a paper bag into Frank's hands. "Sandwiches for the road," she whispered. "And there's cash in there too. Don't argue with me about it." Sophie hugged Martha tightly, burying her face in the older woman's shoulder for a moment. When she stepped back, both of them were wiping away tears. Frank took out a notepad from Martha's drawer and wrote a quick note. "Thank you for everything. We'll never forget your kindness. F.S.L." He left it propped against the cookie jar where Martha would find it in the morning. The old farmhouse creaked softly around them as they made their final preparations to leave. Martha stood at the kitchen window, one hand pressed against the glass, as Frank carried a sleeping Lily to the truck. Sophie followed with their bags, taking one last look at the warm kitchen that had been their sanctuary, even if just for a little while. The neon sign of the Valley View Motel buzzed and flickered against the dark sky, casting alternating shadows of red and blue through the thin curtains. Frank sat in a worn armchair near the window, his body tense despite his exhaustion. Every passing car made him glance through the gap in the curtains, watching headlights sweep across the nearly empty parking lot. They'd driven for hours after leaving Martha's, taking back roads and switching directions several times to throw off any tail. Lily had fallen asleep in the back seat, her head resting against Sophie's shoulder. Now both girls were curled up on one of the twin beds, Lily still clutching the scrapbook they'd started at the farm. The room was small but clean, with faded flowered wallpaper and a dated TV bolted to the wall. Frank had checked every corner when they arrived, making sure the bathroom window was securely latched and testing both locks on the door. He'd parked the truck where he could see it clearly from their second-floor room. Sophie tossed and turned on the bed, her face troubled even in sleep. The past few days had taken their toll. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her shoulders remained tight with tension even as she rested. She'd barely touched the sandwich they'd picked up from a drive-thru earlier. Frank's phone vibrated in his pocket, making him start. He answered it quickly, keeping his voice low. "Tom?" "Frank." Tom's voice crackled with static. "I've been going through the files from that USB drive. This is bigger than we thought. The money laundering operation at the hotels? That's just the tip of the iceberg." Frank moved closer to the bathroom, not wanting to wake the girls. "What do you mean?" "There's evidence of bribery, blackmail, connections to organized crime. Sophie's stepfather has his fingers in a lot of dirty pies. But I need Sophie's statement to verify some key details before I can publish. There are dates and locations that only she can confirm." Running a hand through his hair, Frank glanced at Sophie's sleeping form. "She's been through enough already, Tom." "I know. But her testimony could make the difference between this being a solid story and one they can sweep under the rug. These people have expensive lawyers, Frank. We need everything buttoned up tight." A car door slammed somewhere outside, and Frank moved back to the window, just a tired-looking couple checking into their room. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "How soon do you need her statement?" he asked. "The sooner the better. Every hour we wait gives them more time to cover their tracks or get to her first." Tom paused. "Look, I'm in Cedar Rapids. Why don't you meet me tomorrow? I know a place, quiet, secure. She can tell me everything face to face." Frank considered their options. They couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, Sophie's stepfather's men would catch up to them, or the money would run out, or both. Getting her story out might be their best chance at keeping her safe. "Hold on," he said, then moved to gently wake Sophie. She startled awake, eyes wide with fear until she recognized him. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," he assured her quietly. "Tom's on the phone. He wants to meet tomorrow. Get your statement about everything you saw and heard. Would you be up for that?" Sophie sat up carefully, trying not to disturb Lily. She pulled her knees to her chest, making herself small. "Will it help? Really help?" "Tom thinks so. With your statement, he can publish the story. Get the truth out there where they can't hide it." She was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay, I'll do it." Frank spoke into the phone again. "She'll meet with you. Text me the details." "I will. And Frank, be careful getting there. These people are getting desperate." After hanging up, Frank returned to his post by the window. Sophie hadn't laid back down. "Try to get some more sleep," he told her gently. "I'll keep watch." "What if," she started, then stopped herself. "What if what?" "What if telling the truth makes things worse? What if they hurt you and Lily because you helped me?" Her voice trembled slightly. Frank moved to sit on the edge of her bed. "Sophie, listen to me. Sometimes doing the right thing is scary, but letting bad people get away with bad things because we're afraid, that's scarier. We're gonna get through this together." She nodded, wiping quickly at her eyes. "Promise?" "I promise. Tomorrow we'll meet Tom, and you can tell him everything. Then we'll figure out the next step." Frank managed a small smile. "One day at a time, okay?" "Okay." Sophie lay back down, pulling the thin motel blanket up to her chin. "Thank you, Frank, for everything." Frank returned to his chair, settling in for the long night ahead. The neon light continued its steady pulse outside the window, and somewhere in the distance, a truck's engine rumbled past on the highway. He checked his phone. Tom had sent the meeting details for tomorrow. Just one more day, he thought. One more day to keep them all safe. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Frank pulled into the parking lot of the Corner Cup Cafe. It was barely 7, and only a few other cars dotted the lot. The cafe's windows were fogged from the warmth inside, meeting the winter chill, making it hard to see who might already be inside. Frank scanned the area carefully before nodding to Sophie and Lily in the back seat. "Looks clear. Tom said he'd get here early to make sure everything was safe." Sophie clutched her backpack tightly to her chest, her knuckles white. She hadn't said much during the drive, but Frank could see the worry etched across her face. Lily reached over and squeezed Sophie's hand, offering a sleepy smile. They walked quickly through the cold morning air to the cafe's entrance. A bell chimed softly as Frank pushed open the door, releasing the scent of fresh coffee and warm pastries. In the farthest corner booth, a man with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses looked up from his laptop. Tom Reyes stood, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile. He'd aged since Frank had last seen him, but his sharp eyes hadn't changed. "Frank Carter," he said quietly, extending his hand. "It's been too long, brother." Frank shook his friend's hand firmly. "Tom, thanks for meeting us." Tom's gaze shifted to Sophie, his expression gentle. "And you must be Sophie. I'm Tom Reyes." He didn't offer his hand, seeming to sense her nervousness. Instead, he gestured to the booth. "Why don't we all sit down? I ordered some hot chocolate for everyone." The vinyl seats creaked as they slid into the booth, Sophie and Lily on one side, Frank next to Tom on the other. A kind-faced waitress brought over 4 steaming mugs of hot chocolate, topped with whipped cream. Lily's eyes lit up at the sight. "I hope you don't mind," Tom said, pulling out a small digital recorder. "I'd like to record our conversation. It's just for my notes. Nothing will be published without your approval, Sophie." Sophie nodded, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "Okay," she said softly. Tom placed the recorder on the table and pressed record. "Take your time," he said. "Just start from the beginning." Sophie took a deep breath. "It started about 6 months ago," she began, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "I was supposed to be doing homework in my stepfather's home office. He had stepped out for a phone call, but his computer was still on." She paused, taking a sip of hot chocolate. A small dot of whipped cream stayed on her nose until Lily quietly handed her a napkin. The simple gesture made Sophie smile slightly before continuing. There was an email open on his screen. It had lists of names and numbers, huge numbers, millions of dollars, and locations of different hotels in our chain. At first, I thought it was just business stuff, but then I saw other things. Names I recognized from the news, people who'd been arrested for drug trafficking and money laundering. Tom typed quietly on his laptop as Sophie spoke, occasionally nodding. "What happened next?" "I started paying more attention after that. When Richard, my stepfather, had business meetings at the house, I'd find excuses to walk past his office. The men who came, they weren't normal businessmen. They had guns under their jackets. I could tell." Frank watched Sophie's face as she spoke. The fear was still there, but something else too, determination. She wasn't just a scared kid anymore. She was fighting back. "The night everything changed," Sophie continued. "I overheard Richard talking to someone about using the hotels to move money and other things. When he saw me in the hallway, he got really angry. The next day, he told my mom I was acting out, that I needed structure. They sent me to this place. They called it a boarding school, but it was more like a prison. Lily reached for Sophie's hand under the table. Sophie squeezed it gratefully. I managed to download files from his computer before they sent me away. Put them on a USB drive. I knew. Her voice cracked slightly. I knew if I tried to tell my mom, she wouldn't believe me. Richard had convinced her I was troubled, making things up for attention. Tom leaned forward slightly. The files you sent me, they're legitimate corporate documents. They prove everything you're saying, Sophie. You were incredibly brave to get them. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. I just want my mom to know the truth. I want her to understand I wasn't lying. She will, Tom assured her. I promise you, when this story breaks, there will be no way for anyone to ignore the evidence. But first, we need to make sure you're safe. He turned to Frank. I have contacts in the FBI's white-collar crime division. Once the story is ready, we can arrange for Sophie to give her statement directly to them. They'll provide protection. Frank nodded, relief flooding through him. Having federal protection would make Sophie much safer than anything he could provide. How long? Sophie asked quietly. 2 days, maybe 3, Tom replied. I need to verify a few more details, run everything through our legal team. But Sophie? He waited until she met his eyes. Your identity will be protected until we're absolutely certain you're safe. You have my word. The waitress returned with a plate of warm cinnamon rolls, setting them in the middle of the table. Lily's face brightened at the sight, and even Sophie managed a small smile as she took one. They spent the next hour going over details, dates, names, specific transactions Sophie had seen. Tom recorded everything, asking careful questions to clarify points. By the time they finished, the hot chocolate mugs were empty, and only crumbs remained of the cinnamon rolls. Tom switched off the recorder and tucked it into his bag. You did great, Sophie. This is going to make a difference. They gathered their things and stood to leave. Frank paid the bill while Tom gave him the address of a safe house where they could stay until the story broke. As they walked toward the cafe's door, Frank glanced out the window. His heart dropped. Across the street, parked between 2 delivery trucks, sat a black SUV with tinted windows. The late afternoon sun was already setting when Frank's pickup turned onto his familiar street. The shadows stretched long and dark across the snow-covered lawns, and the streetlights were just beginning to flicker on. After meeting with Tom, they had decided to make a quick stop home for warm clothes and supplies before heading somewhere safer. Home sweet home. Lily chirped from the back seat, but Frank's gut twisted as they got closer to the house. Something felt off. Sophie sat rigid beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Maybe we shouldn't. Frank slowed the truck to a crawl. His front door stood slightly open, swaying gently in the winter breeze. The porch light he always left on was dark. Stay in the truck, he ordered, his voice tight. Lock the doors. Heart pounding, Frank approached his home cautiously. The snow around the porch showed multiple boot prints, large ones, definitely not belonging to his family. The door frame was splintered near the lock. He pushed the door open slowly, wincing at the loud creak. The entryway light switch clicked uselessly. The power had been cut. Frank pulled out his phone and switched on the flashlight. The beam revealed chaos. Every drawer in the kitchen had been pulled out and emptied, their contents scattered across the linoleum. Cabinet doors hung open, and broken dishes littered the floor. The living room was worse, couch cushions slashed, photo frames smashed, papers everywhere. Dad? Lily's worried voice came from behind him. He spun around to find both girls standing in the doorway, their faces pale in the dim light. I told you to stay in the truck, he said, but without anger. He understood their need to know. Sophie's eyes were huge as she took in the destruction. This is my fault, she whispered. They're looking for. She suddenly bolted past Frank, heading for the stairs. Sophie, wait! Frank called, but she was already running up them 2 at a time. He followed quickly, Lily close behind. Sophie's gasp echoed from Lily's bedroom. Frank's flashlight beam showed pink walls now covered in scuff marks, stuffed animals thrown everywhere, dresser drawers dumped onto the floor. Lily's craft supplies were scattered like confetti across her rug. My backpack, Sophie said, voice shaking as she dug through the mess. Where's my backpack? Lily hugged herself, looking at her destroyed room. I'm scared, Dad. Frank put an arm around his daughter while Sophie frantically searched, throwing clothes and toys aside. They took it, she said, her voice rising with panic. My sketchbook was in there, all my drawings. It's just a sketchbook, Frank started to say, but Sophie shook her head violently. You don't understand. I drew everything in there. Pictures of Mom, our family crest, the hotels. She sank onto Lily's bed, hands covering her face. They'll know I remember all of it. They'll know I can identify everyone involved. Frank's blood ran cold as he realized the implications. Sophie's artistic talent had captured details that could prove dangerous in the wrong hands. He checked his phonino signal. The storm must have knocked out the cell towers. "We need to leave," he said firmly. "Right now, Lily, grab your warmest coat and—" A car door slammed outside. Sophie rushed to the window, then stumbled back. "Black SUV," she whispered, "like the ones that followed us before." Frank's mind raced. The back door, but no, they'd probably covered that. The garage might work, if they could get to the truck without being seen. "Follow me," he said quietly. "Stay low." They crept down the hallway toward his bedroom. Frank knew the old house's layout by heart, including the fact that his window had the best view of both the driveway and the back alley. He could see where the SUV was parked, its headlights off, but engine still running. "We can make it to the truck if we go through Mrs. Peterson's yard," he whispered. "There's enough shadow to—" He turned and found only Lily behind him. Sophie was gone. They hurried back downstairs, checking each room. The kitchen was empty, but there on the table, illuminated by Frank's flashlight, lay a hastily scribbled note. "I can't let them hurt Lily. I have to go." Frank ran to the back door just in time to see a slim figure disappearing into the snowy darkness. Sophie had slipped away into the night, choosing to face her pursuers alone rather than risk Lily's safety. The SUV's engine revved in the distance, then faded away. Frank stared at the note on his kitchen table, his hands trembling as he read Sophie's hastily scrawled words again. "I can't let them hurt Lily. I have to go." The paper crumpled in his fist as he bolted for the front door. The cold air hit him like a slap as he ran onto the porch, his eyes scanning the dark street in every direction. "Sophie!" His voice echoed off the silent houses, but there was no answer. Mrs. Henderson from next door hurried over, still wearing her gardening apron despite the late hour. "Frank, I saw that poor girl running down the street about 10 minutes ago. A black SUV pulled up beside her. I thought maybe you'd sent someone to pick her up." Frank's heart sank. "Which way did they go?" "Headed east, toward the highway." Mrs. Henderson wrung her hands. "Should I have done something? She got in so quickly, I just assumed." "It's not your fault," Frank managed, though his throat felt tight. He rushed back inside, where Lily stood in the hallway, hugging herself. "Dad, where's Sophie?" "Stay with Mrs. Henderson for a few minutes, sweetheart." Frank grabbed his phone and dialed Tom's number with shaking fingers. It rang twice before his friend picked up. "They got her, Tom." Frank's voice cracked. "They broke into the house and she left to protect Lily. Black SUV headed east." "Damn it!" Tom's voice was tight with concern. "Listen carefully, Frank. They're taking her back to the city. That's where Vivian Ashford's headquarters are, the Ashford Tower. Everything leads back there. I'm going after her. You need to be smart about this," Tom cautioned. "These people are dangerous. I'm calling in some favors with local law enforcement, but it'll take time. The story's ready to go live, but I promise to protect her, Tom." Frank was already gathering his keys and wallet. "I can't wait for the story to break. She's just a kid." "Then get to the Ashford Tower," Tom said firmly. "I'll send you the address. But Frank, be careful. These aren't just business people we're dealing with." Frank hung up and hurried next door. Mrs. Henderson had already made Lily hot chocolate and turned on cartoons in her living room. The elderly woman took one look at Frank's face and nodded. "We'll be fine here. Go get that girl back." Kneeling beside Lily, Frank pulled her into a tight hug. "I have to go help Sophie, sweetheart. Mrs. Henderson will take good care of you until I get back." Lily's small hands gripped his jacket. "Is Sophie in trouble?" "Yes, but I'm going to fix it." Frank kissed her forehead. "I promise." "Like when you fixed Mrs. Peterson's car, when everyone else said it couldn't be fixed?" Despite everything, Frank managed a small smile. "Just like that. I'll bring her home." Back in his truck, Frank checked the address Tom had sent. The Ashford Tower was 3 hours away in good weather. With his ancient pickup and the icy roads, it might take longer. He didn't care. The engine roared to life, and Frank pulled away from the curb. His headlights cut through the darkness as snow began to fall again, fat flakes swirling in his high beams. The truck's heater rattled and coughed before finally pumping out warm air. The radio crackled with late-night country music, but Frank switched it off. His mind was too full of Sophie's face when she'd first climbed into his truck that snowy night. How lost and afraid she'd looked. How she'd slowly begun to trust him. to smile, to play with Lily. How she'd finally started to feel safe. "I'm coming, kiddo," he muttered, pressing the gas pedal harder as he merged onto the highway. The old truck protested but steadied at a speed that was probably higher than it should be attempting. His phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "Story goes live in 3 hours. We'll meet you there. Don't do anything stupid before I arrive." Frank didn't respond. His focus was entirely on the road ahead, on eating up the miles between him and Sophie. The snow fell harder, but he didn't slow down. The wipers squeaked across the windshield in a steady rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Other cars grew scarce as the night deepened. The highway stretched before him like a dark ribbon, the yellow lines flashing past in an endless stream. Every now and then, he'd pass a semi-truck, its massive frame making his pickup shudder in the wind draft. He thought about Sophie's drawings, in that stolen sketchbook-detailed scenes of hotel lobbies and overheard conversations carefully documented in the margins. She'd been so brave, gathering evidence while pretending everything was normal, and now she'd given herself up to protect his daughter. The truck's engine coughed, and Frank patted the dashboard. "Come on, old girl, just a little further." The vehicle seemed to respond, settling into a steady rumble as it carried him through the night. Signs for the city began to appear, counting down the miles. Frank's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Somewhere ahead, in that maze of steel and glass, Sophie was alone with the people she'd fled from, but not for long. The snow eased as he approached the city limits, the urban glow turning the sky a dull orange. Skyscrapers rose like shadows against the horizon, and among them, Frank knew, was the Ashford Tower, where Vivian Ashford ran her empire and where her daughter needed help. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Tom. "Almost there. Wait for me." Frank tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. He couldn't wait. Sophie had trusted him to keep her safe, and he'd failed once already tonight. He wouldn't fail again. The city streets were nearly empty at this hour, traffic lights changing from red to green for no one. His truck looked out of place among the occasional luxury cars that glided past, but Frank didn't care. He followed the GPS directions, drawing closer to the heart of the financial district where the Ashford Tower waited. A thin layer of snow dusted his shoulders as he drove through the silent canyons of buildings. The truck's headlights reflected off glass and steel, creating strange patterns that danced across the deserted sidewalk. Finally, he turned a corner and saw it. The Ashford Tower, rising 60 stories into the night sky, its spire disappearing into low clouds. Light blazed from the lobby despite the late hour, and a few windows high up still glowed. Frank pulled into a parking spot across the street, killed the engine, and sat for a moment, studying the building. Somewhere in there was Sophie, probably scared, definitely alone, but not for much longer. He stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. The tower loomed above him, but Frank didn't feel intimidated. He'd faced worse odds in the National Guard, and this time, he was fighting for someone who needed him. Without hesitation, Frank walked toward the building's entrance, his reflection growing clearer in the polished glass doors with each step. He wasn't waiting for Tom, wasn't waiting for the story to break. Sophie needed him now. Snow pelted Frank's windshield like tiny white bullets as he guided his old pickup through the city streets. Towering buildings loomed above him, their lights blurred by the thickening storm. His truck, so dependable on country roads, felt out of place among the sleek luxury cars that occasionally passed by. The Ashford Tower stretched toward the sky, its glass exterior reflecting the swirling snow even in the darkness. Frank pulled into a nearby parking lot that offered a clear view of the building's main entrance. The lot's flickering lights cast shadows across his weathered dashboard. He turned off the engine but left the key in the ignition. The sudden silence made the howling wind seem louder. Frank pulled his worn jacket tighter around himself and leaned back in his seat, his eyes fixed on the building where Sophie's mother worked. The events of the past few days played through his mind like a movie he couldn't stop. He remembered Sophie's face when he first spotted her on that snowy road, how small and cold she'd looked, the way her hands had wrapped around that hot cocoa mug at the diner, her fingers gradually regaining their color as she warmed up. Frank's chest tightened as he recalled Sophie helping Lily with her math homework at his kitchen table. The two girls had clicked instantly, giggling over shared jokes he didn't understand. Sophie had shown such patience, breaking down each problem until Lily's face lit up with understanding. At Martha's farm, Sophie had surprised them all by knowing how to make cookies from scratch. "My grandmother taught me," she'd said quietly, measuring flour with careful precision. "Before she passed away." It was one of the few times she'd mentioned her family without that guarded look crossing her face. The wind rocked his truck, and Frank pulled out his phone to look at the photo Lily had insisted on taking during their brief stay at the farm. Sophie stood between him and Lily, her smile genuine for once, flour dusting her dark hair. They looked like a real family. He hadn't known it was possible to miss someone so much after knowing them for such a short time. But Sophie had carved out a space in their lives that now felt painfully empty. Even his house seemed too quiet, without her soft voice or the sound of her pencil scratching against paper as she drew in her sketchbook. Frank checked his watch. 3:47 a.m. The storm showed no signs of letting up. He reclined his seat slightly, knowing sleep wouldn't come easily, but needing to rest before facing whatever morning would bring. His phone showed no new messages from Tom, who was probably still working on the story that could expose everything. The night crawled by in fits and starts. Frank dozed off occasionally, only to jerk awake at every passing car, hoping to catch a glimpse of Sophie. Each time, disappointment settled heavier in his stomach. Around 5 a.m., early morning workers began trickling into the building. Security guards in crisp uniforms took their positions. Frank watched them all, studying their routines, looking for any sign of Sophie or the men who'd taken her. He thought about the note she'd left. "I can't let them hurt Lily." The words had been slightly smudged, as if tears had fallen while she wrote them. Sophie had sacrificed her own safety to protect his daughter, his family. Now it was his turn to protect her. The snow gradually eased as dawn approached. Frank used a handful of napkins from his glove compartment to wipe condensation from his windows, keeping the building in clear view. The rising sun painted the glass tower in shades of pink and gold, making it look almost warm and welcoming despite its imposing height. At 6:30, Frank finally stepped out of his truck. His joints protested after the long night, and he stretched carefully, aware of how out of place he must look in his work clothes and old jacket. The morning air bit at his face as he walked toward the building, his boots leaving tracks in the fresh snow. The lobby doors were heavy glass and chrome, rotating slowly as early executives entered. Frank took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and stepped inside. The contrast between the bitter cold and the lobby's warmth made his ears ring. Everything gleamed: the marble floors, the brushed metal walls, the elaborate light fixtures overhead. A massive Ashford Hotel's logo dominated the wall behind the security desk. Frank's work boots squeaked against the polished floor as he approached the front desk, leaving small puddles of melted snow in his wake. The pristine lobby stretched before him, a world away from his small-town life. But somewhere in this building was the woman who needed to hear the truth about her daughter, and Frank wasn't leaving until she did. The marble-floored lobby of Ashford Tower gleamed under pristine lighting. Frank's work boots left wet marks on the polished surface as he approached the curved security desk. His reflection in the dark granite counter showed a man who hadn't slept, his usually neat appearance rumpled from the hours in his truck. Two security guards in crisp black uniforms watched him carefully. The younger one stepped forward, hand resting casually near his hip. "Can I help you, sir?" "I need to see Vivian Ashford," Frank said, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "It's about her daughter." The guard's expression didn't change. "Ms. Ashford's schedule is fully booked. If you'd like to make an appointment?" "No appointments," Frank cut in. "This can't wait. Sophie's in danger." At the mention of Sophie's name, the older guard touched his earpiece. The younger one moved closer to Frank. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Frank planted his feet firmly. "I'm not going anywhere until Vivian Ashford hears what I have to say." More security personnel appeared from side doors, their faces stern. The lobby's other occupants, men and women in expensive suits, gave them a wide berth as they hurried to elevators. "Last warning," the young guard said. "Leave now or we'll remove you." Frank raised his voice, not shouting but projecting clearly across the lobby. "Tell Vivian Ashford that Frank Carter is here about Sophie. Tell her Sophie left this note." He held up the crumpled paper from his kitchen table. The older guard spoke quietly into his radio. Minutes ticked by. Frank stood his ground as office workers streamed around him, shooting curious glances his way. His back ached from the night in his truck, but he didn't move. Finally, the elevator doors opened. Vivian Ashford stepped out, every bit as elegant as her magazine photos. Her gray suit looked perfectly pressed. Her silver-streaked dark hair swept into a precise twist. Her heels clicked sharply on the marble as she approached. "I'm Vivian Ashford," she said, her voice cool and controlled. You claim to have information about my daughter? Frank met her eyes. They were the same, deep brown as Sophie's. Your daughter's been staying with me and my little girl. She ran away from that boarding school because she found out something about your husband's business dealings. Something illegal. Vivian's perfectly composed expression didn't waver. My daughter is safe at her school. I spoke with the headmistress myself last week. No, ma'am. Frank pulled out his phone and showed her a photo Lily had taken of Sophie helping with homework at their kitchen table. She was at my house until last night. Then some men broke in, ransacked the place. Sophie left this note saying they threatened my daughter if she didn't go with them. He held out the note. Vivian took it with manicured fingers that trembled slightly as she read Sophie's hurried handwriting. That's impossible, she said, but uncertainty had crept into her voice. Robert would never. Your husband's been using the hotels for money laundering? Frank said quietly. Sophie overheard something she shouldn't have. That's why he sent her away. She has proof she gave it to a reporter friend of mine. Color drained from Vivian's face. Robert said she was acting out, making wild accusations. She's terrified, Mrs. Ashford. Those men who took her, they work for your husband. They've been following us for days. Sophie's not safe with them. Vivian's perfectly maintained facade cracked. She stared at the photo on Frank's phone, Sophie smiling, helping Lily with math homework, looking relaxed and happy. I haven't seen her smile like that in years, Vivian whispered. She's a wonderful girl, Frank said gently. Smart, kind, great with my daughter. But right now, she needs her mother to believe her. Vivian's hand tightened around Sophie's note. Her other hand went to the pendant at her throat, golden locket identical to Sophie's. When you say she has proof, documents, recordings, all on a USB drive. My reporter friend has copies. He's ready to publish, but we wanted to make sure Sophie was safe first. The mention of her husband's name had shattered Vivian's careful composure. Her eyes widened with dawning horror as pieces clicked into place. Sophie's desperate phone calls from school, Robert's insistence on handling all communication with their daughter, his late-night meetings she'd never questioned. Oh God, she breathed. What have I let happen to my baby? Vivian Ashford's office occupied the entire top floor of the building. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the snow-covered city, but Frank barely noticed the scenery. He sat in a leather chair, watching as Vivian paced back and forth, speaking rapidly into her phone. I want them there within the hour, she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed instantly. Every facility, every property we own within a 100-mile radius. Yes, all of them. She paused, listening. I don't care about clearance levels. This is my daughter we're talking about. Frank's hands gripped the armrests of his chair. The past hour had been a blur, security escorting him upstairs, Vivian's face turning pale as he explained everything, and then her immediate action. She'd been on the phone ever since, mobilizing what seemed like an army of private investigators. Cross-reference all check-ins at our medical facilities with any signature or approval from James, she continued, referring to her husband. Focus on private wings, restricted access areas. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor as she turned. And get me Detective Morrison from the Financial Crimes Unit. A young assistant hurried in with a tablet, showing Vivian something that made her stop mid-stride. There, she said, pointing at the screen. That signature pattern. It's the same one he uses for board documents. She turned to Frank. We've found something. The next 45 minutes felt like years. Vivian's team worked with precision, narrowing down locations and cross-checking security footage. Frank watched as she transformed from the polished CEO he'd first met into a fierce mother bear, demanding updates every few minutes. Got it, the assistant finally announced, bursting into the office. Private clinic on the outskirts, registered under a subsidiary company, but the authorization trails lead directly to Mr. Ashford. Vivian grabbed her coat. Call ahead. Tell them I'm coming personally, and if anyone tries to stop me, they'll be looking for a new job before sunset. She turned to Frank. You're coming with me. The drive to the clinic took 20 minutes through the snowy streets. Vivian's driver navigated the luxury sedan smoothly while she made more calls, arranging for police to meet them there. Frank stared out the window, his heart pounding. He'd promised to protect Sophie, and now, finally, they were close. The clinic looked more like a spa retreat than a medical facility, with its modern architecture nestled among snow-covered pine trees. A team of suited investigators met them at the entrance, along with 2 police cars parked discreetly at the side. "Third floor, East Wing," one of the investigators reported. "Private suite under the name Sarah James." 2 guards posted. Vivienne strode through the automatic doors like an avenging angel, her wool coat billowing behind her. The clinic staff scrambled to get out of her way. Frank followed close behind, his protective instincts on high alert. At the 3rd floor, they found the guards already being questioned by police. One look at Vivienne's face, and they quickly stepped aside. She pushed open the door to the suite, Frank right behind her. Sophie sat in an armchair by the window, wrapped in a thick blanket, her face turned toward the falling snow. She looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable than Frank remembered. At the sound of the door, she turned, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Mom?" Her voice cracked on the word. Vivienne rushed forward, all her CEO composure forgotten. "Sophie! Oh my God, Sophie!" She pulled her daughter into her arms, and Sophie burst into tears. "I tried to tell you," Sophie sobbed into her mother's shoulder, "about James, about everything, but he said you wouldn't believe me." "I'm so sorry," Vivienne whispered, stroking Sophie's hair. "I'm so sorry. I didn't see it sooner. But I believe you now, and I promise you, I promise, nothing like this will ever happen again." Sophie pulled back slightly, her tear-stained face uncertain. "Really? Really?" Vivienne cupped her daughter's face in her hands. "The police are already looking for James. He'll never come near you again. I've been such a fool, so blind, but that ends today." Sophie's eyes found Frank over her mother's shoulder. "Frank helped me," she said. "He protected me when no one else would." Vivienne turned to look at him too, her eyes full of gratitude. "Yes, he did, and we'll never forget that." Frank felt a lump in his throat. The sight of Sophie safe in her mother's arms made everything, the sleepless nights, the fear, the chase, worth it. Quietly, he backed toward the door. This was their moment, a mother and daughter finding their way back to each other. They needed privacy to begin healing. As he slipped out into the hallway, he heard Sophie's voice again, stronger now, telling her mother everything. Frank smiled to himself. Sophie was safe. She was home. And sometimes, that was all that mattered. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving mother and daughter to their reunion. Tom Reyes sat in his favorite newsroom chair, watching multiple screens as the story broke across every major network. His article had gone live just minutes ago, and already the phones were ringing off the hook. He'd worked through the night, carefully fact-checking every detail from Sophie's USB drive, matching dates and names to corporate records. The headline blazed across screens nationwide. "Ashford Hotels, a front for international crime ring." Below it, smaller headlines detailed money laundering, tax evasion, and connections to organized crime. Sophie's stepfather's name appeared prominently, though Sophie herself remained unnamed, protected as a minor. In a small diner across town, Frank nursed a cup of coffee, his eyes fixed on the mounted TV. The morning regulars had fallen silent, all watching as federal agents led Sophie's stepfather out of the Ashford corporate offices in handcuffs. His perfectly tailored suit couldn't hide the fury on his face as reporters shouted questions. "Mr. Carter?" The waitress touched his shoulder gently. "Phone call for you." It was Tom. "They're bringing in his whole network," the reporter said. "The evidence Sophie collected, it was everything we needed. That girl's got a good eye for detail." Frank smiled, remembering how Sophie would sketch everything she saw, storing away information in her drawings. "She's smart," he said simply. "How many arrests so far?" 12 and counting. The FBI's been waiting for something like this. Turns out they've had suspicions for months, but couldn't get enough evidence. The diner's TV switched to a live feed from the Ashford Hotel's headquarters. Vivienne Ashford stood at a podium, her usual perfect composure showing slight cracks of emotion. Camera flashes lit up her face as she began to speak. "First, I want to thank the brave individuals who brought this corruption to light," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Particularly one unnamed friend who protected my daughter when I failed to see the danger she was in. Your kindness and courage have saved not only my child but our entire company from those who would use it for criminal purposes." Frank ducked his head, feeling his cheeks warm. He hadn't done it for recognition. "To our employees and partners worldwide," Vivienne continued, "I promise full cooperation with authorities and a complete restructuring of our organization. The Ashford name will stand for integrity once again. The questions came rapid fire from reporters. Mrs. Ashford, did you have any knowledge of your husband's activities? Where is your daughter now? Will you step down as CEO? Vivienne handled each question with grace, neither defending her husband nor revealing Sophie's location. She learned from her mistakes. Protecting her daughter came first now. In another part of the city, Sophie sat cross-legged on a hotel bed, sketching in a new notebook. The TV played quietly in the background, showing footage of the arrests. She paused her drawing to watch as another of her stepfather's business partners was led away in handcuffs. Her mother had given her the notebook that morning, leather-bound, with her initials embossed in gold. For new beginnings, Vivienne had said softly. Sophie's first sketch was of Frank's old pickup truck. Back at the diner, Frank's phone buzzed with a text from Lily. Dad, Sophie's on the news. Well, kind of. They're talking about her but not saying her name. Is she okay? He typed back quickly. She's safe. That's what matters. The diner's TV showed more arrests across the country. Hotel managers, accountants, lawyers who had helped hide the money trail. Sophie's careful documentation had unraveled years of criminal activity. Her detailed sketches of meetings, overheard conversations noted in margins, dates and times meticulously recorded. All of it had helped build an airtight case. Tom's voice came back on the phone. You should see the FBI's faces. They've been trying to crack this for months, and a 16-year-old girl handed them everything they needed. She's always been observant, Frank said, remembering how quickly Sophie had noticed details about his truck's engine when he taught her basic maintenance during their time on the run. Guess being quiet and watching everything finally paid off. The coverage switched to financial analysts discussing the future of Ashford hotels. Stock prices had dropped initially, but were already starting to recover as investors responded to Vivienne's decisive action and transparency. Frank sipped his cooling coffee, relief washing over him as he watched justice unfold. The waitress topped off his cup without asking, patting his shoulder again. Looks like the good guys won this one, she said with a knowing smile. He nodded, thinking of Sophie's tiny wave from the shelter doorway that first night, how close he'd come to just driving past. Sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest choices. The news coverage continued, but Frank barely heard it now. He was remembering Sophie's face when she'd helped Lily with homework, the way she'd carefully explained fractions using cookie pieces, how she'd finally started to relax at Martha's farm, laughing as she fed chickens with Lily. His phone buzzed again, another text from Sophie herself this time. Thank you for believing me when no one else did. Frank smiled, typed back, that's what family does. On the TV, Vivienne was wrapping up her press conference. She looked directly into the cameras, her final words carrying the weight of both public statement and personal promise. To those who helped protect my daughter, you have my eternal gratitude. Sometimes the truest strength comes not from power or position, but from simple human kindness. Frank paid his bill and stepped out into the morning sunshine. The story would dominate the news for weeks to come, but his part in it was done. Sophie was safe, justice was being served, and that was enough. The winter sun cast long shadows through the towering glass windows of Vivienne Ashford's corner office. Frank Carter felt out of place among the sleek modern furniture and abstract art. His work boots had left small puddles of melted snow on the polished marble floor, and his hands, though scrubbed clean, still showed the stubborn stains of years of mechanical work. Vivienne sat behind her massive desk, her posture perfect but her eyes softer than they'd been during their first meeting in the lobby. She'd changed in the past few days. The Ice Queen CEO had thawed into something more human. Maybe it was the relief of having Sophie back, or the shock of discovering her husband's betrayal. But she seemed different now. Mr. Carter, she began, then paused and smiled slightly. Frank, I hope you'll let me call you Frank. He nodded, shifting in the expensive leather chair. Yes, ma'am. What you did for Sophie? Vivienne's voice caught slightly. She opened a drawer and pulled out a white envelope. You put yourself at risk. You opened your home to her. You protected her when I... She stopped, composing herself. When I failed to see what was happening in my own house. Anyone would have done the same, Frank said quietly. Vivienne shook her head. No, they wouldn't have, and we both know it. She slid the envelope across the desk. This is just a small token of my gratitude. Frank didn't touch it. Ma'am, I appreciate the gesture, but I didn't help Sophie for money. Please, just look at it, she insisted. Reluctantly, Frank picked up the envelope and peeked inside. His eyes widened at the check's amount. Enough to buy several new repair shops, with plenty left over. I can't accept this, he said firmly, placing it back on the desk. Frank? Vivian leaned forward, her voice gentle but determined. You work double shifts. Your house needs repairs. Your shop could use new equipment. Let me help you the way you help my daughter. Frank shook his head. The only payment I need is knowing Sophie's safe now. Vivian studied him for a long moment, then smiled. You're a proud man, Frank Carter. I respect that. She took back the envelope and tore the check in half. But what about the girls? The girls? Sophie told me about Lily, about how they became like sisters. Vivian pulled out another envelope. This is different. This is a college fund, for both of them. Equal amounts, to be held in trust until they're ready for university. Frank's throat tightened. He'd been lying awake at night, wondering how he'd ever afford to send Lily to college. His savings account was always one car repair or medical bill away from empty. That's very generous, he managed. It's the least I can do. Vivian stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city. Sophie's gonna need therapy, time to heal, but she talks about Lily every day, about the cookies they baked together, the scrapbook they started. She turned back to Frank. I don't want them to lose that connection. Frank thought about how Lily had been asking about Sophie every morning since she left, how his daughter's eyes lit up whenever Sophie's name was mentioned. And there's one more thing, Vivian continued. I've arranged for a contractor to repair your house. The damage from the break-in, yes, but also the older issues. The leaky roof, the drafty windows, Sophie mentioned them. Mrs. Ashford. Vivienne, please. Vivienne, Frank corrected himself. That's too much. The college funds, maybe, for the girls, but the house is non-negotiable. Her tone was kind but firm. Consider it compensation for damages caused by my husband's men. It's a liability issue, really. A small smile played at her lips. You wouldn't want me to face legal troubles, would you? Frank couldn't help but chuckle at her clever manipulation. You're good at this. I didn't build this company by accepting no easily. She returned to her desk and sat down. The college funds and the house repairs. That's my final offer. Frank looked down at his calloused hands, thinking of Lily's future, of how Sophie deserved every chance to pursue her dreams after everything she'd been through. The house repairs would mean no more worrying about heating bills in winter, no more buckets catching rain in the hallway. The college funds, he said finally, for both girls. But the house? Frank. Vivian's voice was gentle but unyielding. Let me do this, not just for you, but for Sophie. She cares about you and Lily. Knowing you're both taken care of, it would mean everything to her. Frank thought about Sophie's face when she'd first stepped into his humble home, how she'd never once shown anything but gratitude for the simple meals and worn furniture, how she'd helped Lily with homework at their scratch kitchen table, looking more at peace there than in all the luxury she'd grown up with. The repairs only, he conceded. Nothing fancy, just what's needed. Of course. Vivian nodded, satisfied. She pushed the envelope with the college fund documents across the desk. Everything's arranged through a reputable trust. Both girls will have equal access when the time comes. Frank picked up the envelope, this time holding on to it. Thank you, he said simply. No, Frank Carter. Vivian replied, standing and extending her hand. Thank you for showing my daughter that there are still good people in this world, for teaching her what real family looks like. Frank stood and shook her hand, noting how her polished appearance couldn't hide the genuine emotion in her eyes. Just promise me one thing, he said. What's that? Let her be a kid sometimes. Let her bake cookies and make scrapbooks and just be Sophie. Vivian's smile was warm and real. I promise. Frank nodded, tucking the envelope carefully into his jacket pocket. He'd let himself think about the details later, about how both girls would have chances he'd never dreamed possible, about how the house repairs would change their daily lives. For now, he was simply grateful that something good had come from that snowy night when he'd stopped to help a stranger. The contractor will call you tomorrow, Vivian said as he turned to leave. And Frank? Sophie would love to visit soon. With your permission. Anytime, he replied. She's always welcome. As Frank left the office, the envelope felt heavy in his pocket, not with the weight of paper, but with the promise of the girls' futures. He'd refuse the money for himself, but for them, he'd accept this gift, this chance at something better. The late February sun streamed through freshly washed windows, making the Carters' home glow with warmth. The house looked different now. The creaky front steps had been replaced, the walls wore a fresh coat of paint, and the drafty windows sealed tight against the lingering winter chill. But it still felt like home. Lily bounded through the front door, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. "Dad, everything looks so amazing." She twirled in the living room, taking in the repairs that had transformed their modest house. The worn carpet had been replaced with hardwood floors that gleamed in the sunlight, and the old couch had given way to a comfortable new one in warm brown. Frank followed behind her, carrying a box of their belongings they'd brought back from Martha's farmhouse. "Careful there, sweetheart," he said with a chuckle as Lily's spinning nearly knocked over a lamp. "Why don't you go check out your room?" "Oh my gosh, yes!" Lily raced up the stairs, her footsteps thundering overhead. Frank set the box down and walked through the kitchen, running his hand along the smooth new countertop. The refrigerator hummed quietly, a far cry from the rattling old one they'd had before. Despite his initial reluctance to accept help from Vivian Ashford, he had to admit the repairs made their home safer and more comfortable. "Dad, Dad, come look!" Lily's voice echoed down the stairs. "My room is perfect." Frank climbed the stairs, finding Lily sprawled on her new bed, surrounded by the stuffed animals she'd brought from Martha's. The walls were painted a soft yellow, the color she'd always wanted, and fairy lights twinkled around her window. "Sophie's gonna love it when she visits," Lily said, hugging her favorite teddy bear. "When do you think she'll come? Soon? Maybe next weekend?" Frank sat on the edge of the bed. "Let's give her some time to settle in with her mom first, but I'm sure she'll visit when she can." "I miss her," Lily said softly. "It's weird not having her around anymore. Remember when she taught me how to make those braided friendship bracelets at Martha's?" "Of course I do. You two nearly used up all Martha's embroidery thread." Frank smiled at the memory of finding the girls surrounded by colorful strings, their heads bent together in concentration. A car door slammed outside, and Frank glanced out the window to see the mail carrier walking up their driveway. "I'll be right back," he told Lily, who was already arranging her stuffed animals in a precise circle on her bed. The brisk air hit his face as he opened the front door. Among the stack of envelopes was a thick cream-colored one, addressed in careful handwriting. "To Frank and Lily Carter." Back inside, Frank called up the stairs. "Lily, there's a letter from Sophie." The stuffed animals went flying as Lily scrambled down the stairs. "Really? Open it! Open it!" They sat together at the kitchen table as Frank carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a folded letter, along with several loose pages covered in Sophie's detailed sketches. "Look!" Lily spread out the drawings. There was one of Martha's farmhouse, the chickens pecking in the yard. Another showed Lily and Sophie baking cookies, flour dusting their faces. A sketch of Frank's old truck captured every dent and scratch with loving detail. Frank unfolded the letter, and Lily leaned against his shoulder to read along. "Dear Frank and Lily, I've been trying to write this letter for days, but the words never seem big enough to say what I want to say. How do you thank someone for saving your life? For showing you what a real family feels like? Mom and I are doing better every day. We're talking more than we ever did before. She's different now, or maybe I'm seeing her differently. She tells me about when she was young, before the hotels and the money. Sometimes we just sit and draw together, like Lily and I used to do. I miss you both so much. I miss Lily's stories and Frank's terrible dad jokes. Yes, they're terrible, but don't stop telling them. I miss feeling safe and understood, even when I couldn't explain everything that was happening. Lily, thank you for being the sister I never had, for showing me how to feed chickens without being scared of them, and for making me laugh when I was worried. I'm working on a special painting for your room. No hints about what it is, but I think you'll love it. Frank, I don't even know where to start. You could have driven past that night. You could have left me at the shelter. You could have walked away when things got dangerous, but you didn't. You taught me that sometimes the best family is the one you choose. Mom says I can visit soon, once everything settles down. The police are still talking to a lot of people, but Mom's lawyers say it's almost over. My stepfather and his friends will be in jail for a long time. I'm taking art classes now, real ones, at a studio downtown. The teacher says I have natural talent, but I think it's because I had so much practice drawing during our adventure. I've included some sketches I did from memory. They're not perfect, but they help me remember the good parts of those scary days. Thank you for everything, for the rides and the meals and the safe places to sleep, but mostly, thank you for showing me what love really looks like. All my love, Sophie. P.S. Lily, remember to water the little cactus I gave you. Even desert plants need drinks sometimes. Lily wiped her eyes with her sleeve. I'm going to write back right now, and I'll send her pictures of my new room. She rushed upstairs to get her art supplies. Frank read the letter again, his throat tight with emotion. He walked to the refrigerator and pulled out a magnet, one of the silly tourist ones Martha had given them. With careful movements, he placed Sophie's letter in the center of the fridge door, positioning it so the sketches were clearly visible. He stood back, looking at the drawings that captured their unexpected journey together. There was his truck, weathered but reliable. Martha's farmhouse, warm and welcoming. And there, in careful lines of pencil, was his favorite, a sketch of all three of them sitting at Martha's kitchen table, laughing over mugs of hot chocolate. Frank smiled, touching the corner of the letter gently. Some families were born, and some were made along the way, on snowy roads and in quiet moments of trust. The doorbell chimed on a bright Saturday afternoon in March. Frank wiped his hands on a dish towel, having just finished washing the lunch dishes. Through the window, he spotted a sleek silver car parked in his driveway, quite a contrast to his weathered pickup truck. Lily raced to the door before Frank could reach it. "They're here," she squealed, throwing it open. Sophie stood on the porch, looking healthier than Frank had ever seen her. Her cheeks had a rosy glow, and she wore a new blue sweater that matched her eyes. Behind her, Vivienne Ashford stepped out of the car, carrying a covered dish. "We brought lasagna," Sophie announced with a shy smile. "I helped make it." Frank's heart warmed at the sight of them both. Sophie looked so different from the frightened girl he'd found on that snowy road just months ago. "Come on in," he said, gesturing them inside. "It's good to see you both." Lily grabbed Sophie's hand. "Want to see my new art supplies? And Dad built us a tire swing in the backyard." Sophie glanced at her mother, who nodded with an encouraging smile. "Go ahead, sweetheart. Mr. Carter and I can chat." "Please, it's just Frank," he insisted, taking the lasagna from Vivienne. In the kitchen, he set it on the counter while Vivienne settled at the small table by the window. Outside, they could hear the girls' laughter as they pushed each other on the tire swing. The sound made both adults smile. "She's different with your daughter?" Vivienne observed softly. "More free. More like the little girl I remember before." She trailed off, watching the scene through the window. Frank poured them both coffee. "Lily has that effect on people. She never met a stranger she couldn't turn into a friend. Like father, like daughter," Vivienne said, accepting the mug. "I never properly thanked you, Frank, not just for protecting Sophie, but for showing her what family should feel like." He shifted in his chair, uncomfortable with the praise. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Vivienne said firmly. "They wouldn't have. You risked everything, your safety, your home, your daughter's security, for a stranger. That's remarkable." Through the window, they watched as Sophie showed Lily how to make daisy chains from the early spring flowers dotting the lawn. The girls sat cross-legged in the grass, their heads bent together in concentration. "Sophie's starting therapy next week," Vivienne shared. "The doctor says she's handling everything remarkably well, all things considered. She talks about you and Lily constantly." Frank nodded, thinking of the frightened teenager who'd hidden her pain behind silence those first few days. "She's strong. Stronger than she knows." A burst of laughter drew their attention back outside. Lily had managed to tangle herself in the daisy chain, and Sophie was carefully helping her unwind it, both of them giggling. "Dad," Sophie called through the open window, "can you show Lily how to do the braided friendship bracelet thing you taught me at Martha's farm?" The word "Dad" hung in the air for a moment. Frank felt his throat tighten with emotion. He caught Vivienne's eye and saw understanding there, maybe even gratitude. "Sure thing, sweetheart," he managed to reply, his voice a little rough. "Let me grab some string." He found embroidery floss in Lily's craft box and joined the girls in the yard. The grass was cool and slightly damp beneath them as they sat in a circle. Frank demonstrated the simple braiding pattern he'd learned years ago in summer camp, then watched as Sophie patiently showed Lily how to weave the colorful threads together. "You're really good at teaching," Lily told Sophie admiringly. Sophie beamed at the compliment. "Well, I had a good teacher." She bumped her shoulder against Frank's, and he felt that new word, "Dad," echo in his heart again. Vivienne brought out lemonade and cookies, and they all sat in the spring sunshine, talking and laughing. The afternoon stretched on, golden and peaceful. Frank noticed how Vivienne had relaxed, her corporate polish softening into something more natural. She'd kicked off her expensive shoes to sit in the grass, letting Lily show her how to make a proper daisy chain crown. As the sun began to dip, Sophie helped Frank fire up the old grill, while Vivian and Lily set the table inside. The rich smell of cooking lasagna filled the kitchen, mingling with the aroma of grilled vegetables. "This is nice," Sophie said quietly, as she handed Frank a plate of bell peppers to grill. "It feels like how things should be." Frank understood what she meant. The easy warmth of family, the simple joy of sharing a meal together. These were the things that healed, that made a house a home. They gathered around the kitchen table, which seemed smaller with 4 people, but somehow perfect. Lily chatted excitedly about her school's upcoming spring concert, while Sophie shared news about her art classes and a mural she was helping paint at a local community center. The lasagna was delicious, and Frank noticed with satisfaction that Sophie took seconds, a far cry from the girl who'd barely touched her food that first night at the diner. Vivian had relaxed enough to tell funny stories about her own childhood, making the girls laugh with tales of her misadventures learning to cook. Laughter filled the kitchen, bright and genuine. Frank looked around the table at these faces that had become so dear to him. His sunshine-hearted Lily, brave Sophie, who'd found her smile again, and Vivienne, who was proving to be as resilient as her daughter in her own way. Sophie caught his eye across the table and gave him that special smile that now reached all the way to her eyes. That one word, Dad, still echoed in his heart, a gift he'd never expected but would always treasure. The kitchen was warm, with more than just the lingering heat of the oven. It was warm with connection, with healing, with the kind of love that builds bridges across the broken places and makes families out of strangers. As they passed around second helpings of lasagna and shared the last cookies, Frank knew that this simple moment of shared joy was what really mattered. The evening air held a crisp chill as Frank settled into the old wooden rocking chair on his front porch. The sky had cleared after a cloudy day, revealing a tapestry of stars that sparkled like scattered diamonds. He could still smell the lingering aroma of the pot roast they'd shared for dinner, and his heart felt full from the warmth of the evening they'd just spent together. Lily padded out in her fuzzy pink slippers, clutching her favorite blanket. Without a word, she climbed onto his lap like she used to do when she was smaller, though now her legs dangled over the side of the chair. Frank wrapped the blanket around them both, and the chair creaked gently as they rocked. "That was nice," Lily murmured, her head resting against his shoulder. "Having Sophie and Miss Vivienne over." Frank nodded, his thoughts drifting back to that January night that seemed both yesterday and a lifetime ago. The wind had been fierce then, cutting through his jacket as he'd spotted that lone figure on the road. He remembered how Sophie had huddled against the passenger door of his truck, her thin coat offering little protection against the winter cold. "You know, Sweet Pea," he said softly, "I almost drove past that night. Almost told myself it wasn't my business, that someone else would help." Lily shifted to look up at him. "But you didn't." "No, I didn't." Frank gazed at the stars, remembering the way Sophie's hands had trembled around that cup of hot cocoa at the diner. Something just didn't feel right about leaving her there. The porch swing at the far end of the deck swayed slightly in the breeze, reminding him of the afternoon they'd spent installing it last weekend, a gift from Vivienne that he'd finally accepted after Sophie insisted. He smiled, thinking of how different things were now compared to those tense days on the run. "Remember Martha's farm?" Lily asked, playing with a loose thread on the blanket. "And how Sophie taught me to make those chocolate chip cookies?" "Sure do. You two nearly covered the whole kitchen in flour." Frank chuckled at the memory. "Martha still talks about that when I call her." A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched a satellite track slowly across the night sky. Frank thought about the USB drive that had changed everything, about those nerve-wracking days waiting for Tom's story to break. He remembered the gut-wrenching moment they discovered Sophie's note, and the desperate drive to the city through the storm. "Dad?" Lily's voice was thoughtful. "Did you know it would turn out okay when you first stopped to help Sophie?" Frank shook his head. "No, honey. I just knew someone needed help. Sometimes that's all you can know." He thought about Sophie calling him Dad earlier that evening, how natural it had sounded, how it had caught in his chest like a physical thing. He thought about Vivienne's transformation from a distant corporate figure to a fierce mother bear fighting for her daughter, the way she'd hugged him before leaving tonight, whispering, "Thank you," with tears in her eyes. The night air grew cooler, and Frank pulled the blanket tighter around Lily. A car passed on the street, its headlights sweeping across the front yard where Sophie and Lily had spent the afternoon drawing with sidewalk chalk. The colorful designs still decorated the driveway, hearts, flowers, and a surprisingly good sketch of Frank's old truck that Sophie had drawn. "You know what Sophie told me today?" Lily said, yawning. "She said that night in your truck was the first time she felt safe in months. She said she knew right away you were one of the good guys." Frank's throat tightened. He remembered Sophie's words from earlier. "You're the dad I wished I had growing up." How she'd hugged him tight, no longer the scared girl from that snowy night, but a young woman growing into her strength. Above them, the stars continued their ancient dance across the sky. A meteor streaked past, quick, bright, and gone in an instant, like that moment of decision on a dark winter road. Frank thought about how life could pivot on such small choices, stopping or driving past, offering help or minding your own business, speaking up or staying silent. The porch light cast a warm glow around them, and Lily's breathing had grown deeper, more rhythmic. Frank knew she was fighting sleep, trying to stretch out this peaceful moment just a little longer. He understood the feeling. Something cold and wet touched his cheek. Looking up, he saw the first snowflakes beginning to fall. Not the harsh driving snow of that January night, but gentle flakes that drifted down like feathers. They caught the porch light as they fell, each one a tiny miracle of ice and light. Lily stirred. "Look, Dad, snow!" "Just like the night we met Sophie," Frank said softly, watching the flakes settle on the porch railing. They stayed there, father and daughter, as the snow continued its gentle descent, coating the world in a fresh blanket of white. It covered Sophie's chalk drawings, but Frank knew new ones would replace them soon enough. He thought about the college funds Vivian had set up, about the future opening up for both girls. He thought about second chances and new beginnings, about how help often comes from unexpected places, and how giving it can transform the giver as much as the receiver. The snow fell silently around them, and Frank held his daughter close, overwhelmed by gratitude for this moment, for the simple gift of being able to help when help was needed. Sometimes, he whispered more to himself than to Lily, the smallest kindness can change everything. The snow continued to fall, gentle as a blessing, while father and daughter watched in peaceful silence, wrapped in their blanket and the quiet magic of the moment. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you thought this was just the beginning, you're right. Click through and see where the story takes you next. If you enjoyed the story of Frank Carter, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.